Somebody Else's Gentleman, written by P.O. Dixon, read by Lily. Chapter 1. Some Natural Importance. September 1811. Elizabeth lifted her hand and shielded her eyes, protecting them from the bright sun. Her gaze drifted over the rippling waves. She could easily find some modicum of tranquility at the pond, mere footsteps from the manor house in Longbourn village. Gliding swans, their wings rippling, quacking ducks bobbing up and down, and flocking geese calling out, abounded. She found the quiet solitude of the isolated pond on the outskirts of the estate more to her liking. A tranquil body of water of some natural importance, it always proved a welcome respite from the hysterical state at Elizabeth's home. How enchanting the pond is, Elizabeth thought. Why would I wish to be any place else when such delightful charms await me here? Elizabeth took a deep breath of the fresh air, composing herself. She opened her arms wide, closed her eyes, and inhaled deeply. She repeated this exercise several times, taking in the clean air and allowing it to uplift her spirits with its soothing effects. After she had taken in her fill, she opened her eyes and began occupying herself in deep reflection on the world outside her private sanctuary. The need to seek refuge from the hectic pace at home was undoubtedly a trait she inherited from her father, Thomas Bennet. His solace was being alone in his library with his books, although it had not always been that way. He used to enjoy long outings at that very spot Elizabeth now cherished as her own little piece of paradise, usually with Elizabeth in tow. There, he spoke to her of distant places, different languages, and diverse cultures while they watched the tiny sailboat he had made for her floating on the water, the same toy boat she had earlier tethered to a low-hanging branch and cast adrift on the pond. Her father was a fount of information. Even as a young child, Elizabeth was always eager to take it all in. That was years and years ago. Now Mr. Bennet hardly bothered doing anything that required a modicum of exertion. Not paying attention to his family was his most egregious offence. No, he would much rather make fun of them. Elizabeth sighed. She had her father's penchant for mocking her mother as her excuse for being at the pond that day. Her mother, Fanny Bennet, had been going on and on about Netherfield Park, the estate that abutted her father's, and its being let at last. She spoke of its new occupant being a single young man from the north, and how he must be in want of a wife, preferably one of her 5 daughters. All her father had to do was consent to her mother's request to call on the young man, which, in Elizabeth's opinion, was perfectly reasonable. Though she did not always agree with her mother's matchmaking antics, in this case her mother was right. If Mr. Bennet did not visit the new neighbour, then none of them could do so. Mrs. Bennet was not the only one excited because a new eligible gentleman had arrived in their midst. Elizabeth had to admit to being a little intrigued too. There was no security to be had in living on an estate entailed away from the family's female line. Say what one will about my mamma, she is keenly aware of the perils, despite my father not caring. But then again, such perils would only come to be once my father was to pass away, at which point his earthly concerns must indeed cease. And if none of my sisters or I should marry before my father's demise, what might become of us? Why would Longbourn's new owner not toss us into the hedgerows as my mamma fears? It was a hot, late summer day. The deep coolness of the water looked so refreshing, half tempting Elizabeth to take a swim. Having walked to the isolated pond, she was not sure she was up to the exertion. She was rather tired from not having slept very well the night before. Her younger sister Lydia had upended the entire household's night with constant complaints of feeling poorly. I am sure I would not be so worn out had Lydia not made such a fuss. But alas, when Lydia is miserable, everyone is miserable. Added to that, she knew not to swim alone. Elizabeth decided it best to sit on the bank and dip her feet into the water. She rid herself of her shoes and stockings. It felt good. Through the years, She had spent so many hours sitting on that bank, watching her little toy sailboat float idly. Thoughts of one day sailing across the water often drifted through her mind. What must it be like to visit faraway places? Elizabeth's wont to read fueled her desire to visit other parts of the world. Perhaps one day my own gallant knight will charge in on his white horse and carry me far, far away from Hertfordshire. She chuckled inside. Surely one can dream. In truth, Elizabeth knew her future husband would not ride in on a white horse. She knew he would not show up on her wedding day, dressed like an outlandish knight in shining armour, and take her away. He is far more likely to come riding on a little grey donkey. A farmer, perhaps, and take me away to some small village. Perhaps we might settle down in a quaint house with 4 or 5 little children. Her eager imagination sometimes got away from her and envisioned grander things: a house in town, many fine carriages, fancy jewels, ample pin money, and, not to be forgotten, a country estate with lakes and streams and a large manor house backed by wooded hills. It would indeed be nice if I were to marry a gentleman capable of providing such things, but it will never happen. She knew it. Yet and still, it is just as easy to dream of a grand manner of living as it is to dream of more modest means. I posit my time is far better spent dreaming of the former. In that vein, Elizabeth wondered what the supposed gentleman would look like. Would he be handsome? How handsome would he be? Would he be of noble blood? She wondered what kinds of things he would do for her. Would he treat her well? Would he love her, treasure and adore her? Having recently celebrated her 20th birthday, another thought came to mind. What is taking my knight so long to come riding in to take me away? A strong breeze blew some loose hair out of her face. Yawning, she outstretched her arms above her head, clasping her hands. Perhaps it is time to return to Longbourn. Elizabeth stood and smoothed her skirt, shielding her eyes from the bright sun. She pored over the pond, reflecting the sun's rays. How vexing! Amid her musings, she had lost sight of her toy sailboat. She plainly saw the string used to tether her boat dangling from the leafy branch, but somehow the boat had broken free. At length, she glimpsed its tiny sail reflecting. The boat drifted farther and farther away from her. Retrieving the tiny boat was essential for sentimental value, if nothing else, being that her father had handcrafted it for her when she was but a child. I have kept it all these years. I shall not part with it now. Her shoes and stockings she had earlier discarded. Now everything needs to go. That is everything except my chemise, she thought, while undressing and tossing her other clothing to the ground. Elizabeth had no choice, despite echoes of warnings instilled in her since her youth not to swim alone. She could not lose one of her most cherished possessions. Besides, she always considered herself a decent swimmer, and she did not know what the harm would be. She waded into the pond, the water creeping up and up her ankles until she was knee-high in the pond, and then she began swimming. For a moment she lost sight of the boat entirely. She swam on. When Elizabeth could see the toy sailboat again, she then contemplated the rest of her way. How upsetting. She had swum even farther than she had thought she would have to. She had never swum so far alone. It was deeper than she thought, and the pond no longer looked pleasant and inviting. She pondered the dangers of the murky water, its density, its subtle currents, and its temperature. Not that any such thoughts mattered. Elizabeth had come too far to turn back empty-handed, and she was closer to the boat than she was to the bank anyway. Stroke by stroke, she swam toward the toy sailboat until she was near enough to reach it with her fingertips. Gently, she pulled the sailboat to her and clasped it to her chest. She was about to swim back, but a sharp pain arrested her leg. Utterly excruciating pain. Oh no, this cannot be happening. My leg is cramping. Unable to swim, she released her grip on the sailboat and clutched her calf instead. She reacted in horror, her head sinking just beneath the choppy surface. The more she panicked, the greater her peril became. But what was she to do? The pain in her leg was debilitating. Submerging below the surface, frantically bobbing to the top, there was nothing but water as far as her eyes could see. Floundering, Elizabeth screamed out as loud as she could. Her movements grew sluggish. Then her head submerged under the water again, and she struggled to hold her breath. I am drowning. Struggling, thrashing, she could not save herself. She cried out in terror, desperately aware of the perilous water and the helplessness of her situation. A scream ripped from her throat as her head went under the water. She struggled to break the surface once again. Disoriented, panicked, she could not breathe. Elizabeth was not sure where she was. Gasping for breath, she struggled to get her bearings. She tried to scream, but she could not. There were more bubbles, and then she was sinking in water, water that was entirely black. No one is coming for me. No one. I do not want to die. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy capped off his mad gallop through the park with a leisurely stroll, his horse trailing slightly behind. Having removed his coat, he had it folded over his arm. His loosened cravat hung casually around his neck. Although he was far, far away from his home in Derbyshire, his own estate boasted of several lakes and streams, so it was only natural he should find himself in such an idyllic, albeit isolated spot. His being there during that time of year was uppermost in Darcy's mind. What on earth had his friend Charles Bingley been thinking of letting an estate in Hertfordshire? Of all places, Darcy scoffed. At least Bingley did not come right out and buy the place. What a mistake that would have been to make such an enormous commitment after seeing the estate for only a few minutes. Still, his friend needed Darcy's tutelage in the management of such a large property. Darcy honed his experience in one of the grandest estates in Derbyshire, Pemberley. Despite years of watching and learning from his father, the late Mr. George Darcy, Darcy's turn to assume the role as the master came sooner than he would have wished. If nothing else, his time in Hertfordshire might give him leave to escape his own responsibilities, even if only for a short while. Besides being responsible for hundreds of people's livelihoods, Darcy had also assumed the role of co-guardian of a sister more than a decade his junior. Her name was Georgiana, and Darcy really loved her. Unfortunately, he came close to losing her that past summer, and to a fate that would almost have been worse than death. His young sister fell prey to the vilest man, a Mr. George Wickham. He was bent on gaining control of her fortune of £30,000 had they eloped to Gretna Green, as the scoundrel had intended. Fortunately, Darcy arrived at Ramsgate in time to put an end to the scheme. Darcy now walked along beside a tranquil pond just on the edge of what he supposed was his friend's estate. All things considered, he really needed this solace. To that day, the aftermath of the Ramsgate affair wreaked havoc on his equanimity. He hoped never to lay eyes on George Wickham, who incidentally had once been his friend, ever again. Darcy might have returned to town with Bingley, who had gone there to retrieve the rest of their party, specifically Bingley's brother-in-law, Reginald Hurst, and his wife, Mrs. Louisa Hurst, and Bingley's other sister, Miss Caroline Bingley. Doing so would have defeated Darcy's purposes, for spending too much time with Miss Bingley was not his idea of what he ought to be doing. Moreover, rumour had it amongst their society that he was the rightful property of Miss Bingley. Unchallenged rumours at that. What did it matter to him what others thought of his future marital felicity? He knew he would never marry the young lady, and she had to know it too. Darcy understood how the scheme benefited him. Eager mammas in town with young daughters in want of husbands rarely looked his way. But as regarded the advantage to Miss Bingley, he was rather less certain. Unless she secretly aspires for something more. Darcy shook his head to perish the thought. Not that he did not like the young woman. Unlike her elder sister, who was rather less handsome and whose manners required intimacy to make them pleasing, Miss Bingley at least looked the part of an accomplished young woman with all her comely features. She was used to being admired, and she loved to be courted and waited for. educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, and in possession of a fortune of £20,000, she was in the habit of associating with people of rank. She was, therefore, in every respect, entitled to think well of herself. No force of nature could have been more calculated to give her a high opinion of her own attractions. Mr. Darcy was very far from feeling all these sentiments for Miss Bingley. He liked her well enough, but he could not always understand her. Miss Bingley was, after all, the one who concocted the scheme of putting up such a pretence. Going along with their ruse in town was easy, especially as the two of them rarely saw each other. But now that they were to be under the same roof in Hertfordshire for months, Darcy knew he had to be careful. One false move and he might very well step into a marriage trap before he knew what he was about. Violent screams interrupted his peaceful walk, desperate cries for help sending his heartbeat racing. Mr. Darcy swiftly followed the shouts. A young woman was in the water, struggling, thrashing and floundering. "She is drowning! Help!" she cried out, her voice choked and gurgling with water. The woman battled to stay afloat. Darcy could see her dark, wet hair, her waterlogged attire, and her arms and legs flailing beneath the water. She was sinking fast. He had to save her. He dived in and swam as fast as he could to the woman. She was so far away. He feared he might not reach her in time. He would have to dive to the bottom of the pond and get her, but how deep was the water? Could he find her in time? Could he hold his breath long enough? What if I cannot find her? What if... Chapter 2. Too inviting to ignore. Darcy held the young lady in his lap, cradled in his arms. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked, patting her face, his voice evidencing his concern. Her eyes fluttered, but Darcy was unable to tell if they were open or closed. Her chest slowly rose and fell with each breath. Finally, Darcy exhaled. She is safe. His loosened cravat had fallen to the ground before he dived into the water. Having retrieved it, Darcy gently wiped her face. Her steady breathing and her body's reaction to his touch informed him she was out of danger, although her eyes were shut. Instead, she nuzzled closer. She was a beautiful young woman, though not in a conventional way. She had long, dark hair and flawless skin, yet her womanly figure belied her youthful countenance. "Miss?" The voice was low, the most alluring sound Elizabeth ever heard, and accompanied by light taps on her cheek. The touch was soothing, and she could feel her body's response even in her semi-conscious state of being. "Miss?" he asked again, his voice softer, more tender, but with the music still there. It was a melody she could listen to for the rest of her life, and never grow tired of. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Miss?" Elizabeth felt as though she were in somebody's arms, someone holding her steady. She opened her eyes. "Sir?" There she was, wrapped in a man's arms, a man with a deep, melodious voice. "I am not dreaming. I most certainly am not dead." She gasped. "You rescued me?" He nodded in reply. He moistened his lower lip, an unconscious habit perhaps. As though she was oblivious to her own dishabille, Elizabeth's gaze poured over his body, the way his wet shirt clung to his broad chest, leaving little to her imagination. She seized the cravat from his hand and brushed it against his neck. "Your clothes are soaking wet." "My clothes are the least of my concerns at the moment. My thoughts are only of you, of your safety." Their gazes met. He tightened his hold, pulling her into his body. His arms tightened, his form securely wrapped around her. This was what she wanted. This was just what she needed. His closeness, his warmth, his protection, and his whispering reassurances. This was everything she desired. She had no strength to resist or even the will to do so. Nor did she have the desire to tear her eyes away from his. His head lowered, blocking out the sight of her eyes as he sought her lips. "Yes," Elizabeth thought. Never had she dreamed of a kiss so perfect, instantly arousing every part of her body, much-needed warmth coursing through her veins. A low moan escaped from her. She had never been kissed before. How fitting that she should share her first kiss with someone so beautiful. As he lifted his head, his eyes inquiring, it surprised Elizabeth to find she had never felt so alive, so comforted in a passionate embrace. Their lips met once more, and she felt a weakness in her limbs. Her hand rose to his shoulder, and the touch of him made her sink into his body. They were perfectly suited with her slight weight to his tall form. She was aware of only him, of how he held her, of the beating of his heart, how he had been the means of saving her from certain death. How grateful she was for his nearness, how safe she felt in his arms. Her reaction to him was palpable. Elizabeth had always been attracted to men of intelligence, and he must certainly be an intelligent man. She could read it in his eyes, in the way he conducted himself. His mind was keen, and it showed. His mouth closed on hers, and his tongue made a tentative foray. Oh, this is wonderful. The kiss was like nothing she had ever imagined, and she had given the matter a fair amount of thought. Elizabeth's sense of modesty and decorum seemed to have been washed away with the pond's water. His lips, so soft, she thought, in between light kisses. Then she caught her breath with the incidental brush of his arm. She opened her eyes and gazed at him. An avid learner, Elizabeth was always improving her mind through extensive reading, including subjects about the intimate goings-on between a man and a woman. What she was experiencing was indeed the stuff of romantic novels. Knowing as she now did that life was too short, she meant to enjoy every minute. The man, this perfect stranger. She just wanted him to hold her. She wanted them to keep doing what they were doing until she felt safe again. Safe enough to surrender the protection, the pleasures, and the reassurances he bestowed so freely, so willingly, and so generously. Much like my knight in shining armour. Elizabeth studied the young man. He was tall and lean. His face was all planes and angles, much like his physique. His face was the most handsome thing she had ever seen. Dark brows arching over dark, brooding eyes tapered to a noble cleft chin and well-sculpted lips. His protruding Adam's apple completed this picture of perfection. The sight of him mesmerized Elizabeth. It was a miracle he had even been there and rescued her. Who was he? From where had he come? Was he even real, or was she dreaming? "Your clothes, where are they?" he asked. "We ought to get you out of this." His eyes fell on her wafer-thin chemise. It would not do. "They are by the tree just over there?" "I shall get them for you." "No, no, not just yet. Pray do not let me go," she said, shivering. "I am utterly dazed with what almost happened. It is as if I was everywhere, at once, and nowhere, all at once, you see." "Yes, I see," he said in a low voice. "I know what you mean. That is how I feel, holding you in my arms like this." She smiled. "I hope I am not a bother." He shook his head. "Would you be willing to hold me until I am settled?" "I would be more than happy to," he replied. "Just for a few moments more," she said. "For as long as you want me to." Comforted, Elizabeth nuzzled her cheek against the gallant stranger's broad chest. Then, slowly, she drifted off to sleep. Chapter 3. Half in Love. Already. Darcy returned to the pond nearly every day. Whether he secretly wished to see the young woman he had saved from drowning, he dared not confess, not even to himself. All he knew was being there brought him great solace. The pond was peaceful and, by now, his favourite place in all of Hertfordshire. The sky clear and bright, and the sun's rays reflecting off the water's surface, recalled him to the natural beauty of his Derbyshire home. While visiting one day, he spotted a toy sailboat that had crashed into the water's bank. Retrieving it, Darcy turned the little sailboat upside down. He knew and understood its significance at once when he saw the name carved on its underside, Lizzy. So this is the reason the mysterious young lady was out swimming alone in the pond. She meant to retrieve this sailboat. Darcy bit his lower lip, remembering the taste of hers. Lizzie, he silently considered. I suppose it is short for Elizabeth. Elizabeth? At least he now had a name for the bewitching creature who haunted his dreams both day and night. Whenever he thought of her, which was all the time since he first laid eyes on her, one question stood out in his mind. The question was not why he retrieved her dry things and remained with her until her chemise was dry enough for him to see that she was correctly attired before quitting her side. But rather, why did he kiss her? He could think of no reasonable explanation that might hold up in the day's reality. What I know with absolute certainty is it was impossible to stop once I had made a start. Once we made a start, he silently corrected himself, for she seemed as eager to continue their amorous pursuits as he was, and was he ever? Else he would not reimagine every second with her repeatedly. Returning his attention to the sailboat, he noted the damage to its cloth sail. He tucked it under his arm and made a mental note to repair it upon his return to the manor house. Speaking of which, he reminded himself that he had stayed away long enough. As his friend Charles Bingley's guest, Darcy owed it to him to put up some pretense of sociability. That night, the Netherfield party was to attend an assembly in Meryton, the nearby town. He had a sinking feeling that Miss Bingley would cling to him all evening, and quite frankly, he was not sure that would be a bad thing. Eager mammas with simpering daughters in want of wealthy husbands lay in wait wherever he went. Indeed, this evening will prove no exception. Later that evening, Mr. Darcy walked through the parted crowd with Miss Bingley by his side, secure in the knowledge that the eager mammas, scattered throughout the room with their silly daughters, would know not to waste their time with him. He made sure not to make eye contact with anyone as an added precaution. Suddenly there appeared before him the embodiment of all his recent dreams. It is her, indeed it is Elizabeth. I would recognise her among a sea of people. He simply stared until the moment their eyes met, and then he tore his eyes away. It is Elizabeth. Before Darcy knew what he was about, hordes of locals started forming a welcome line in front of his party. Sir William Lucas, who had made a point of calling on Netherfield soon after Bingley's arrival, took up the task of introducing everyone. One by one, family after family with unmarried daughters paraded before them. No, flaunted themselves was more like it. Donned in gowns no one in town who was anyone would dare wear, the eager females giggled, simpered, and cooed. The spectacle of it all tempted Darcy to walk away. That was until the Bennets of Longbourn landed in front of them. Now he could not tear himself away even if he tried. What he could do, however, was maintain his well-crafted stoic reserve. Let his friend Bingley put on a welcoming smile. He was bound to fall in love before the evening was over anyway. Such was his nature, always falling in and out of love with one angelic creature or another. The eldest Bennet daughter would do the job nicely, Darcy considered, with her fair skin, blonde locks, and cherubic eyes. Judging by Bingley's smile, he is half in love with her already. While Bingley gushed throughout the introductions, Darcy barely nodded at the young lady. He made a point of reacting in that same indifferent manner during all the introductions, including his formal introduction to Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Finally, Darcy had a full name for the intoxicating creature who invaded his dreams. Of course, that was the only way he would know her. In his dreams. It was better that way. Who was to say he had not encouraged her expectations already, given the way they first met? He would not look at her luscious lips, arched in a teasing smile, or her dark, bewitching eyes daring him to do so. Neither would he admire her light and pleasing figure or be affected by her playful exchange with his friend Bingley. As for his treasonous body, it had better not betray him now, of all times. Darcy released a deep breath, one he did not even know he was holding in, when finally the Bennets were on their way. Stealing away from her friends for a breath of fresh air during the middle of a public assembly was not the wisest thing Elizabeth could have done. But exceedingly vexed, young ladies did not always comport themselves judiciously. Elizabeth exhaled a frustrated breath she had been holding in for some time, even while dancing on the crowded assembly room floor. She was not always dancing, though, for there were far too many young ladies in want of partners, and far too few available gentlemen. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy could not even be ranked among the latter group. Not that he was not available, he simply was not willing. She heard someone complain of overhearing him tell his friend Mr. Bingley that he was in no mood to give consequence to young ladies who had been slighted by other men. Slighted by other men? Was that how he pictured a young woman in want of a dance partner? Was such a remark not a slight in and of itself? The audacity of Mr. Darcy to speak that way, especially as Elizabeth had been without a dance partner several times throughout the evening. And poor Miss Bingley. Mr. Darcy did not even dance with her when it was clear she would have appreciated the preference. Like two peas in a pod, he did not dance, and thus she did not dance. Are not the two of them perfectly designed for each other? Truth be told, part of Elizabeth was instantly envious that Miss Bingley had this man's attention. Either that or piteous. Yes, the other woman was practically attached to his side, but he scarcely showed any symptom of affection for her. She, on the other hand, gazed at him like he was a prized possession. She clung to his arm, despite its being tightly clenched by his side. Elizabeth could hardly understand this picture of Mr. Darcy standing beside his would-be bride. Why the utter lack of affection, for she knew him to be a most passionate man. A familiar wave of excitement washed over her in remembrance of their time together by the pond. Time very much like a dream. But how could it have been a dream when she had his cravat neatly tucked away in her drawer? Its smell always carried her back to that moment in time when it seemed the two of them were the only two people in the world. Is that the problem? Does Mr. Darcy feel guilty over his unguarded behaviour toward me at the pond? Is that why he scarcely acknowledged me during my family's introduction to his party? Because of his connection with Miss Bingley? Does he fear what happened between us might jeopardise his situation with her? Whatever is the case, I do not mean to make myself upset about it. However, I shall oblige Mr. Darcy in spades if feigning indifference is how he intends to proceed. Miss Bingley can knock the proud man over the head with a club and drag him off to the wedding altar tonight for all I care. Another part of her could not wash away the vision of him inside the assembly hall. So tall, so handsome with his noble mien. Rumours circulated he had £10,000 a year and he owned half of Derbyshire. Everything about him spoke the truth of said rumours. He wore the finest clothing of anyone in the room. His attire was more elegant than his lady's, which was really saying something. Miss Bingley was donned in the height of London fashion, so far as Elizabeth could tell. Miss Bingley was a comely young lady, to be sure. Both she and her sister enjoyed their fair share of beauty. But, as proud as the young woman must certainly be for all her wealth and accomplishments, she was little more than a shrinking violet standing next to Mr. Darcy. The gentleman exuded power, wealth and status from head to toe. Speaking of his attire that evening, his white pristine cravat was knotted and tied with an expert hand in a perfect diagonal, the perfect knot for a perfect neck, forcing another one of Mr. Darcy's white cravats to cross her mind. Elizabeth shook her head. No, it may have been his once, but it is mine now, and I have no intention of returning it to him. Her reasoning made sense. Mr. Darcy's cravat served as the one thing she had that reminded her she nearly lost her life that fateful day, that she had not dreamed it. Her knight in shining armour really did rescue her, and then caringly attended to her in his warm and comforting embrace. It really happened. Yes, she would definitely keep it, but she was sure she would not be tucking it under her pillow that night. Elizabeth's mind wandered to their time together at the pond, the feel of his lips brushing against hers, and the tantalizing caress of his fingers dancing down her neck. He had awakened her desires in a way she never dreamed possible. The memory still made her body ache for his touch. How were such feelings to be endured, now knowing what she knew about the gentleman who had saved her life? That he was haughty and above his company and cared little about the feelings of others, apparently even hers. Chapter 4. Truth in that. Miss Bingley's patience with her brother's morning guests had worn thin. Nothing exhausted her more than making small talk with self-important country nobodies. "I thought the steady flow of neighbours would never cease," cried the young woman when the last of the callers took their leave of Netherfield. Her elder sister, Mrs. Hurst, sighed. "Yes, it seems every mamma in the county has decided our brother is the rightful property of one of their daughters. Our brother is exceedingly popular. I imagine he would not have been half so much if he had not danced with every young lady at the assembly, even if he is so charming. Let us not forget handsome and rich." "Heaven forbid," said Mrs. Hurst, "and let us not forget the adage that a single young man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." "There is truth in that," said Miss Bingley, nodding. She turned to her brother. "Perhaps you ought to have exhibited more reserve like our Mr. Darcy." Bingley scoffed. "Heaven forbid! I cannot recall the last time I saw Darcy standing around looking so stupid." He looked at his friend and continued, "I did not see you dance even once." "Much to Caroline's chagrin," quipped her sister. Darcy said, "I'm sure your sister's decision not to dance was one entirely of her own making. As for me, Bingley, you know how I am not fond of dancing unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as that, it would have been insupportable. I dare say there was scarcely a single woman in the room who it would not have been a punishment to me to stand up with." "What a shame that you should say so. I, for one, have never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I did that evening, and there were several of them who were uncommonly pretty." "I take it the one uppermost in your mind is Miss Bennet," said Mrs. Hurst. "Indeed, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld." "You would say such a thing," said Darcy with a slight eye-roll. "While we are on the subject, it quite surprised me that the second eldest Bennet daughter did not accompany her mother and sisters on this morning's call." Miss Bingley frowned. "What was her name?" "Elizabeth," Darcy began with far more eagerness than he had intended. "Miss Elizabeth." Miss Bingley threw him a puzzled look. Then she said, "I think I should like to get better acquainted with both of the eldest sisters. From what I observed at the assembly, they seem to be more sensible than most of the young ladies we have met, although I can hardly credit the three younger girls with a modicum of sensibility. The eldest daughter is the most amiable creature I ever saw, and so easy to talk to. I suspect Miss Elizabeth to be of a similar temperament," said the other woman. "Indeed," said Miss Bingley. "The sister next to Miss Eliza in age has a pedantic air and conceited manner. The two youngest are silly, wild-spirited, and bound to make their family ridiculous unless someone curbs their behaviour. The youngest is the silliest, with a strong dash of wanton recklessness thrown in." "Miss Eliza?" Darcy asked, as though that was the only thing he took away from Miss Bingley's unflattering testimony. "Indeed," Miss Bingley began. "Short for Miss Elizabeth. How should I refer to the young lady?" He shrugged. "Eliza is not a name I would choose if I were you. It reflects a heightened sense of either intimacy or disdain. I do not believe you have known her long enough to suffer either of those sentiments." "Oh, intimacy for sure," And though I have yet to earn the right to boast of such a connection at this very moment, I have every intention of garnering that privilege soon." Darcy was about to ask why, but then he felt he had already said too much on the subject of Miss Elizabeth Bennet. The last thing he wanted was for Miss Bingley to grow suspicious. As for Elizabeth's not calling on Netherfield with her family that morning, he did not know what to make of it. Was she purposely avoiding him? "Well, I think it is wonderful that you plan on getting better acquainted with the eldest Bennet daughters. They are our closest neighbours in proximity, after all. What more convenient recipe for intimacy is there than that?" asked Bingley. "Here, here," said Mr. Hurst, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Then it is decided we shall return the Bennets' morning call the first thing tomorrow," declared Mrs. Hurst. Miss Bingley nodded. "Agreed." "I should be happy to accompany you on your visit," Bingley returned. "I see no benefit in denying myself the opportunity of spending more time with Miss Bennet." He looked at his friend. "Should you like to join us as well?" Darcy scoffed and then stood to quit the room. "Do not be ridiculous." He went straight to his apartment. Elizabeth's sailboat caught his eye. He had yet to repair its sail and thus decided it was as good a time as any to start. In truth, Elizabeth's noticeable absence that morning frustrated him far more than he wished, and he could do nothing about it. While repairing the sail, Darcy could not stop his mind from wandering. He kept thinking about Elizabeth's beautiful bright eyes, her barely held smiles, and her teasing personality. But most of all, he could not help thinking of having her near-naked body in his arms after rescuing her from the pond, of attending to her safety, of staying with her so long wanting to comfort her, and of wishing their situation allowed him to do more. Indeed, more of the things they did every night since he first laid eyes on her. If only in his dreams. Their secret encounters, their shared intimacies, and the way she fit so wondrously in his arms. Thoughts of their formal introduction at the assembly crept into his mind. Darcy couldn't help but recall the way her eyes danced when she laughed. She was the most bewitching creature he had ever seen. Darcy closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. He could neither control it nor ignore it. He could not stop his thoughts of her, or the way she made him feel when he thought about her. His desire for her was so strong. He feared in the end that it might cloud his judgment. For a second, he had even given some thought to calling on the Bennets at Longbourn with the others. But, thankfully, he came to his senses before it was too late. Until he could get his thoughts of Elizabeth under proper regulation, he meant to keep as far away from her as possible. Chapter 5. Matters of the Heart. Elizabeth, her intimate friend Charlotte Lucas, and her dearest sister Jane easily escaped the room without drawing attention to themselves. General talk of the Meryton assembly with Mrs. Bennet, Lady Lucas from the neighbouring estate, and all the others gathered about had been exhausted so far as Elizabeth was concerned. Now it was time for serious talk about the amiable Mr. Charles Bingley and Jane's prospects for marital felicity with such a man. The three ladies lounged about Jane's bedchamber. Elizabeth said, "Dearest Charlotte, our Jane is just modest," in response to Jane's attempt to shy away from the topic. "You should have heard her going on and on about Mr. Bingley the other night." "What did I say other than he is just what a gentleman ought to be?" "I am certain of that, and I suspect you reminded Jane how handsome Mr. Bingley is and wealthy. Let us not forget about that," said Charlotte. "I did," Elizabeth replied, smiling in the wake of her friend's retort. "It is a fact of life that all women desire gentlemen who are rich and handsome," declared Charlotte with a roll of her eyes. "They feel sorry for themselves if they have to settle for less." "But I need not settle for less," declared Jane with great determination. "Dearest Charlotte, he is the man of my dreams," she proclaimed with all the fervour of a schoolgirl. "Meeting him at the assembly was like a dream come true, and I hardly know whether I should believe it." "We were all present, dearest Jane," Elizabeth exclaimed, ignoring Charlotte's bewilderment. "Therefore you must believe it." "I do hope it is soon that I see Mr. Bingley again," said Jane, smiling softly. I know he will be happy to see you, Elizabeth said. Dearest Jane, Charlotte said, I applaud you for your frankness so early on. I know how cautious you can be when it comes to such matters of the heart, but I would caution you that your Mr. Bingley's affections may be fickle. What do you mean? Both Bennet sisters asked in unison. I do not mean to dampen your enthusiasm. Pray, do whatever you must to secure him if that is what your heart truly desires. Just be mindful that he is a young man whose acquaintances must always be increasing, and he did let Netherfield Park with hardly any real consideration at all. The opinions of others might easily sway a young man of Mr. Bingley's temperament. Then what do you suggest I do? I suggest you do 3 times more than what is in your true nature and take every opportunity to win him over before he has a chance to change his mind. Charlotte, Elizabeth cried, why are you speaking this way? What you are positing sounds ridiculous. Charlotte was the oldest of the 3 women by nearly half a decade, which must shed light on her stance. She merely shrugged. I know were I in Jane's shoes, that is precisely how I would act. What if I chose not to act in such a manner? Jane asked. Then you might never have what your heart desires. Believe me when I say that you have to make a concerted effort for it to work. I could not have imagined you advising Jane to do such a thing as you proposed earlier, Elizabeth said to her friend as the 2 of them were walking to Lucas Lodge, Charlotte's home and Longbourn's neighbouring estate. Charlotte merely smiled and nodded. You know as well as I do what a tall order that was. Jane rarely shows her true feelings to anyone. Which is exactly my point, Charlotte said, stopping to regard her friend directly. You saw the way Mr. Bingley comported himself at the assembly. He was agreeable and gregarious and a stranger to no one. Do you not imagine he comports himself that way everywhere he goes? Do you suppose Jane is the only woman he has ever singled out in such an unabashed manner within minutes of making her acquaintance? In addition, you saw the other members of his party, his sisters in particular, to say nothing of his friend Mr. Darcy. That gentleman has a very critical eye, and I imagine he does not look at any young woman except to find fault. Knowing Mr. Bingley as the 3 of them do you not suppose they will be overprotective of him and quick to do everything in their power to keep him from falling in love with someone outside their circle? In 9 cases out of 10, a woman had better show more affection than she feels. Bingley likes your sister undoubtedly, but he may never do more than like her if she does not help him on. He has made a start by singling Jane out at the assembly. Now it is up to her to do everything in her power to encourage him every step of the way, right up to the altar. Elizabeth said nothing. Charlotte placed a hand on Elizabeth's arm in concern. Dearest Eliza, I'm very sorry if I have done anything to hurt your feelings. I hope you will forgive me. It is not you. It is just that Jane is so shy. She has always been the serious type, and as good as she is, I do not wish for her to miss this chance. Are you afraid I may have done Jane a disservice? Elizabeth smiled. No, of course you did not. I know you wish Jane every success with all your heart, as do I, and you are only looking out for her best interest. Elizabeth and Charlotte always enjoyed each other's company. Indeed, Elizabeth enjoyed Charlotte's company more than she enjoyed that of most of the Bennet family. The 2 of them were not such intimate friends for nothing. In many ways, Elizabeth was closer to Charlotte than she was to Jane. She also liked how intelligent Charlotte was. Intelligent and practical. Elizabeth understood the veracity of Charlotte's advice. She could well imagine the throngs of young ladies in town wanting to secure a man like Charles Bingley. Of course, the same must be said for his friend, Mr. Darcy, his currently attached friend, if his behaviour at the assembly was any sign. Thoughts of Mr. Darcy led to thoughts of her own predicament. Elizabeth was not ready to tell Jane the truth about Mr. Darcy, not yet, perhaps never. with so much to conceal laced with her uncertainty of what was real and what might only be a part of her imagination, what might she possibly confide without implicating herself, as well as the gentleman in a scandal? Elizabeth certainly had not told her intimate friend. What would Charlotte's advice be if she knew of Elizabeth's secret history with the gentleman? No doubt Charlotte would be brutal in her assessment and blatantly frank with her advice. Forget about my mother. Charlotte would see that I was marching to the altar. I posit that is all the more reason to keep what happened at the pond that day to myself. Chapter 6. Symptoms of Affection. The ladies of Netherfield soon waited on those of Longbourn, as planned. Miss Bennet's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, though the mother they deemed intolerable and the younger sisters not worth speaking to. A wish of being better acquainted with them was expressed towards the two eldest. This attention was received with the greatest pleasure by Jane, but Elizabeth had her misgivings. For Jane's sake, Elizabeth willingly put aside her doubts. She did not want her suspicions to affect Jane's ability to get better acquainted with any of the Bingleys, especially the brother. On the other hand, when Elizabeth was not doubting the Bingley sisters' sincerity, she questioned the younger's odd fortune. How was it that of all the women in England, Miss Caroline Bingley was the one to boast of an alliance with Mr. Darcy? Forget about the fact that Elizabeth had detected no real symptoms of affection on the gentleman's part, and for whatever reason, she felt she ought to be the judge of such things. Still, the two of them had rarely strayed from each other's side at the assembly. They talked to no one other than their own party, aside from curt mandatory civilities. If Mr. Darcy were as devoted to Miss Bingley as the two would have others think, how might Elizabeth's encounter with him at the pond be explained? How was it to be believed? Elizabeth was a curious creature by design. Her questions needed answers, and she would not be satisfied until she found them. That night's outing would present the perfect opportunity to study the odd pairing, albeit from a distance. And, who is to say? Perhaps I will find that Mr. Darcy and Miss Bingley are perfect for each other. 2 hours had passed before Elizabeth finally gave up studying Mr. Darcy and his lady and turned her thoughts to the rest of the party. Studying her sister engaging with Mr. Bingley proved a far pleasanter prospect. As best Elizabeth could tell, Jane was making an effort to follow Charlotte's advice. She was listening attentively to Mr. Bingley, and there was a particular liveliness evident whenever she spoke. Rather than bestow an abundance of lovely smiles, as Jane often did with everyone she knew, with Mr. Bingley, she laughed. Unfortunately, Elizabeth could not be so pleased with what she observed of her other sisters, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. The latter two, the youngest Bennet sisters, seemed content to flirt with any gentleman who would deign to seek them out, especially those who donned red coats. Why any intelligent man would want to seek them out puzzled Elizabeth, for her silly sisters spent more time giggling and squirming than engaging in any conversation. This irritated Elizabeth tremendously. Poor Mary only wanted to stand idly by the pianoforte and wait for the instrument to be opened, for she was always eager for exhibition despite her skills being wanting. How Elizabeth wished Mary's constant prevailing on the Lucases would go ignored. But alas, Mary prevailed and sat down and played as best she could, unknowingly attracting more condescension than praise. Her clumsy playing only made Elizabeth inwardly grumble. Undoubtedly, Mary's lack of prowess reflected severely on all her sisters, evidencing her family's failure to prevail on London masters in this particular case. Not that it was anything to be ashamed of. Such of the sisters as wished to learn never wanted the means. They were always encouraged to read and had all the necessary masters. Those who chose to be idle indeed might. How wretched Mary must look to Bingley's sisters, trying to play the pianoforte when, in truth, she was far from able to hammer out anything beyond a few awkwardly inelegant tunes. Elizabeth's younger sister's behaviour, in general, must indeed reflect poorly on Jane in the Netherfield party's eyes as well. She could not even pretend to be happy with her predicament. Later in the evening, Elizabeth found herself in the proximity of Mr. Darcy and Miss Bingley. They were talking with Mr. and Mrs. Hurst. None of them were aware of her presence, else they surely would not have been discussing what they were discussing, and Mr. Darcy surely would not have said what he said. Elizabeth's fury increased with each passing second, her thoughts of Jane's felicity, her only reason for restraint. Once again, Elizabeth stood outdoors at a gathering of her friends and acquaintances. All alone, she peered at the night sky. As if she did not have enough reasons to dislike Mr. Darcy, his catalogue of faults was mounting with each opportunity that brought the two of them in company. He had yet to acknowledge her existence as anything more than an indifferent acquaintance with his curt bows and taciturn ways, but that was not the reason for that evening's vexation. It was a scathing remark Elizabeth heard him utter to his supposed intended, "She a beauty. I should as soon call her mother a wit." Elizabeth knew not for sure of whom the two spoke. It did not matter. That the gentleman would speak so uncharitably of anyone was enough to justify her ire. Miss Bingley, being the person she was, laughed and laughed. Maybe that is why he abides her so well. She is the type of female who looks and speaks solely for his approbation. If that is the sort of female he prefers, it is just as well that he and I should keep our distance from each other. Unbeknownst to Elizabeth, she was not alone. Mr. Darcy had followed her. Oh, he had maintained a respectable distance for propriety's sake. The last thing he needed was to find himself in a compromising situation by approaching her. It was enough for him to remain a safe distance away with an eye toward guarding her reputation. She was by far the most imprudent person he had ever met, what with her penchant for taking long, solitary walks about the countryside, stealing away outside for a breath of fresh air at all hours of the night, and, most of all, swimming all alone in isolated ponds. He hoped she did not make a habit of the latter. To the best of his knowledge, having gone there every day, Elizabeth never ventured back to the pond where they first met. Try as he might, Darcy could not deny his attraction to Elizabeth. How easy he found it to look at her. She was not the sort of woman he was accustomed to associating with, and her openness of countenance and vivacity of manner were a refreshing change. She was as bold as she was beautiful. When she smiled, he found himself caught in her trap. His fascination with her had really taken on new meaning. All he wanted was to be near her, even though he did everything in his power to mask his intentions. How could he not? Despite his fascination, nothing more would ever come of it. Miss Elizabeth was not of his sphere. It would be a sin to take her from her world and thrust her into his, would it not? All he could do was think of her, watch over her, protect her should it ever come to that, but he would never have her. And certainly not in the way a gentleman might expect to have another gentleman's daughter. I most certainly did not come to Hertfordshire in want of a wife. Chapter 7. Hopes of her own. The past weeks being under the same roof as Mr. Darcy had done nothing to advance the relationship between Miss Bingley and him. If anything, the two of them had grown further apart than ever. The young lady needed to find fault with somebody, but whom? While discussing the possible culprit, Miss Bingley opined to her sister one day, "You do not think there is a chance in the world that Mr. Darcy might have serious intentions towards someone like that, do you?" "Someone like that?" the elder sister asked, her brow arched. "I am sure you know what I mean. You concede our brother is interested in Miss Bennet, do you not? What is the difference between that and Mr. Darcy being interested in her sister Elizabeth? You know very well how Mr. Darcy can be. Whereas Charles is always falling in love, Mr. Darcy rarely looks at anyone except to find fault." "Do you mean to say anyone but you?" "Of course. If I said it once, I shall say it again. You are a very jealous creature where Mr. Darcy is concerned." I am not jealous. On the contrary, there is no one else for Mr. Darcy other than me. I am as close to his idea of the perfect woman as anyone can be." Mrs. Hurst remained unmoved, but Miss Bingley dropped her arms, sighing. "I hate it when you become an expert on Mr. Darcy. I know more about him than most anyone." "Then tell me, how is he behaving toward Miss Elizabeth?" Mrs. Hurst asked. "And pray, tell me how his behaviour toward her differs from his behaviour toward any other young woman." "In my opinion, he is still as aloof as ever. A change in geography has changed nothing in that regard. In essentials, Mr. Darcy is the same as he ever was." "That is the thing, I suppose. He is maddeningly aloof with me too," Miss Bingley added. Indeed, the disheartened young woman saw him less often than ever, and when she did, he acted as if he did not know her. The older sister did not answer for a long while. Then she spoke. "You know, Caroline, there is an old saying to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. What does that have to do with Miss Eliza Bennet? Invite Miss Elizabeth to Netherfield. Let her know, and in no uncertain terms, how you feel about Mr. Darcy. If she is indeed a friend, she will not entertain hopes of her own." "I suppose I might try that. Do you really suppose she can be so easily worked on like that? Country people of her ilk are always aspiring to be morally upright and beyond reproach, as it were. Once you have offered her friendship, she would not dare betray you." Miss Bingley laughed and clasped her hands in front of her bosom. "Oh, Louisa, you are quite brilliant. That is exactly what I shall do. In fact, I shall extend the invitation to Miss Bennet as well. As close as the two of them are, and as much as Miss Bennet is always endeavouring to impress our brother, there is not a chance in the world that either of them will refuse. I dare say nothing, not even thunder, lightning, wind, or a treacherous downpour, would keep them away." A missive arrived at Longbourn early the next day. How odd that it should be addressed to both Elizabeth and Jane. Odder still was the identity of the sender, Miss Caroline Bingley. No matter how much the Bingley sisters disliked the Bennet family in general, Elizabeth did not allow it to sway her opinion of the brother. He liked Jane well enough already. More time in company with the amiable man would only be a good thing for Jane. Though Miss Bingley's letter did not say, Elizabeth surely hoped Mr. Bingley might make himself available to join the ladies during the visit. There was one potential drawback, however. The skies threatened rain, and Mrs. Bennet was adamant that Jane and Elizabeth must ride horseback. For Elizabeth's part, she would have much preferred to walk, but Jane was more of a horse person. Yes, she would occasionally walk to Meryton with her sisters, but only when walking was the only option. So horseback it was for Jane's sake, or at least as much for Jane's sake as it could be. Of course, Elizabeth would do her part if for no other reason than to be of service to Jane. Elizabeth's concerns about being in company with Mr. Darcy had to be laid aside. "If we make haste, we might arrive at Netherfield in time to avoid the rain altogether," Elizabeth said in a further attempt at assuring her sister of the scheme's viability. "I am willing if you are, dearest Lizzie." "You know I would do anything for you, including playing matchmaker for you and your Mr. Bingley." Jane threw a glance outside the nearest window, her eyes aimed at the sky above. "However, I cannot help but worry about what will happen if the skies open wide during the course of our visit. I should hate to inconvenience the Bingleys by prevailing on them to lend us their carriage so we might return to Longbourn after the visit." "Heaven forbid," said Lizzie half-teasingly. "Let us pray it does not come to that. Shall we be on our way?" As fate would have it, the rain poured from the skies and the winds raged fiercely after the sisters set off on horseback, Jane in front with the brown leather reins looped around her fingers and Elizabeth holding on to Jane. The wind whipped the horse's mane and tail, tossing its locks about. Faintly Elizabeth heard Jane's murmurs of protest, yet the inclement weather did not stop her from pressing forward. Rain fell in a steady stream, drenching their hair and cascading down the sides of their faces into the collars of their day dresses, soaking them through. By then, they were closer to Netherfield than they were to Longbourn. Two choices presented themselves: turn the horse around and race back home, or spur the horse onward. For Elizabeth, it did not matter which choice they made. Her task was the same: to be there for Jane. So they rode on. Chapter 8. Absolutely Something. The next morning during breakfast, Mr. Darcy's stomach dropped. Nothing could have prepared the gentleman for the sudden turn of events. He was sitting with Miss Bingley reading his paper while the young lady droned on and on about the latest Parisian fashions, as though he could be bothered to know about women's clothing, when Elizabeth Bennet walked into the dining room, unannounced at that. For an instant, Mr. Darcy did not know what to say or do. He had never been so surprised by someone's appearance, and he was, if he was honest with himself, a little shocked. He had always thought Elizabeth was beautiful, but the vision before him stole his breath away. She looked like a goddess, her skin supple, glowing and smooth, her cheeks flushed from the exercise of walking, and her dark, bewitching eyes energized by the exertion. She had her dark brown hair in a modest bun, and she wore a simple gown of blue muslin with a brown shawl draped around her shoulders. Darcy dropped his paper and sprang to his feet. Miss Bingley peered over her hot coffee and then set her porcelain cup aside. "Good morning, Miss Bingley," Elizabeth said with a polite curtsy. "And to you too, Mr. Darcy." Mr. Darcy's stomach twisted in knots at her voice. It was so soft and melodic. "I hope I am not interrupting your breakfast." Miss Bingley arose, went directly to her guest, and entwined her arm with Elizabeth's. "Heavens, no! I am so delighted you decided to join us for breakfast, Miss Eliza." "Come," said Miss Bingley, coaxing Elizabeth along. "I am sure Mr. Darcy will be delighted to have you join us as well." She patted Elizabeth's hand. "When I was told you escaped the house at the break of dawn, I feared you had returned to Longbourn and left your poor sister to fend for herself." Elizabeth half smiled. "No, I did not. I am sure my sister needs me, and hence there is no place else I would rather be than close by her side." She walked over to the table and sat down across from Mr. Darcy, who was still in shock at her presence in the room. He and Miss Bingley resumed sitting. He picked up his cup and tried to focus on his coffee, but it was no use. He knew not what to make of this beautiful creature, so unlike anyone he had ever met. An intriguing mixture of innocence and knowing. She had power over him, the likes of which he could not possibly comprehend. He surely did not understand it. He had never been so bewitched by a young woman in his life as he was by her. Elizabeth had already staked out a place in his nighttime dreams. Now she is sitting across the breakfast table from me. Last night, while making love to her in my dreams, she was mere footsteps away. Mr. Darcy shifted in his seat as visions of knowing Elizabeth in that way flashed through his busy mind. "How is our dear Miss Bennet faring this morning?" Miss Bingley asked. "Have you checked on her since you returned from your walk? I looked in on her earlier and she was sound asleep, so I did not have the heart to disturb her." "Yes, Mr. Jones is with her now. I thought I would get a little to eat and then return to Jane's side. But of course, you must be sure to take good care of yourself. We would not want both Bennet sisters falling ill." "What would your mother think of us were that to happen?" She set her eyes on the gentleman. "Is this not a delightful surprise, Mr. Darcy, having Miss Eliza to ourselves?" "A surprise is one way of putting it," he replied. He then looked at Miss Bingley questioningly. He hardly even recognised this picture of the young lady. He looked at Elizabeth. "Pray, what is happening, Miss Elizabeth?" "Did I understand you correctly that Miss Bennet is ill?" Elizabeth nodded. Miss Bingley said, "Did you not know, Mr. Darcy? Miss Bennet and Miss Eliza are now our house guests." The gentleman nearly choked on his hot coffee. "Actually, sir, my sister and I merely came here yesterday for a visit with Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, when my sister fell violently ill." "Yes," said Miss Bingley. "Miss Eliza and her sister travelled here on horseback and, unfortunately, got caught in the downpour. I declare both of them were a dreadful sight. You and my brothers returned so late last night that you could not have known, but Louisa and I insisted that Miss Eliza and Miss Bennet stay here at Netherfield until Miss Bennet fully recovers. She turned to Mr. Darcy. Miss Eliza has been fortunate not to be ill herself. I feel quite well, Miss Bingley, Elizabeth said. I am happy for that, else I should really be worried, said Miss Bingley. Are you certain of your health, Miss Elizabeth? Are you sure you too did not pick up a chill from the rain? Mr. Darcy asked, his voice tender, perhaps a little too tender, as well as too familiar for Elizabeth's preference. Where was the vexing man who spent so much time in public feigning indifference toward her? Perhaps if you are feeling under the weather, he continued, his tone tentative, you should not have opted for an early morning walk. The weather, I fear, is still rather damp. Miss Bingley's eyes opened wide. Are you not the kindest, most considerate gentleman in the world to be asking Miss Eliza about her health, Mr. Darcy? She turned to Elizabeth. Is he not absolutely wonderful, Miss Eliza? Elizabeth silently scoffed. Indeed, Mr. Darcy is absolutely something. She cared not whether Miss Bingley detected the sarcasm in her voice, for a furtive glance at Mr. Darcy told her he most certainly did. Darcy could not wait to escape the dining room. He leaned against the closed door of his apartment and gave his chest a couple of hard slaps. He needed to breathe. How on earth will I endure being under the same roof with Elizabeth night after night for who knows how long? It was all he could do not to reach out and caress her hand when inquiring of her health earlier. It was as though he now felt responsible for her well-being. That was the only way he could explain himself. Thoughts of how she looked when he held her in his arms haunted him, her soaking wet chemise barely shielding her body. Her wet hair spilling down her back, he could almost feel her soft, damp tresses pressing against his cheek. Darcy was in grave danger, and he knew it. His only saving grace was the little ruse with Miss Bingley. Even if Elizabeth harboured thoughts similar to his, as a result of their first encounter, she did not seem like the sort of female who would long for someone who was otherwise attached. In that sense, we are both safe from each other. Chapter 9. A Consummate Gentleman. The following day, Elizabeth made sure to avoid the dining room at all costs, even at the expense of her appetite. Instead, she partook in a light repast while sitting and watching over Jane. Unfortunately, Jane's constitution was never as strong as her sister's, which, in this case, proved quite disadvantageous. Elizabeth stood from her bedside chair and adjusted Jane's bedclothes, careful not to disturb her sister's slumber. Jane should have been sitting at the dinner table with the Netherfield party the evening before, not me. Jane should have been bathing in her new beau's attention. Bingley always asked about Jane's condition, but so far as Elizabeth knew, the young lovers had spent no time together owing to Jane's poor health. However, Bingley's sisters had been quite attentive to Jane, and for that Elizabeth was grateful. When Elizabeth emerged from her sister's apartment later that morning, bent on enjoying a solitary stroll in the park, Miss Bingley insisted on going with her. There was only one subject on the eager young woman's mind. Oh, I cannot tell you how delighted I am to have my brother's best friend as our house guest for 3 months, Miss Bingley exclaimed. Spending so much time with him will be fun. 3 months? Elizabeth was alarmed. How am I to endure 3 whole months of possibly being in frequent company with this man? The more she saw Mr. Darcy, the more afraid of him she was becoming. She could scarcely look at him without recalling the first time she laid eyes on him. And judging by the way his eyes raked all over her whenever he deigned to look her way, Elizabeth could only suppose he recalled their encounter at the pond too. Yes, 3 months. I am not sure how I will cope with so much time to be with him, but I'm sure it will be delightful indeed. The 2 of us sharing all our meals, taking frequent walks about the park. That or horse riding about the estate. That is to say nothing of our spending night after night under the same roof. Here, Miss Bingley blushed a little, although that is not to suggest anything untoward. Mr. Darcy is the consummate gentleman. Elizabeth wondered if Miss Bingley was speaking of the same gentleman she knew. He, a consummate gentleman. Remembering his tender touch almost made Elizabeth forget what she was about, and she trembled deep down inside. Miss Bingley said, "However, Mr. Darcy and I may very well be officially engaged by the end of his stay. Who is to say what might go on between the besotted betrothed?" Elizabeth looked away and rolled her eyes before looking back at her besotted walking companion. "No doubt you must be congratulating yourself on having such an attachment." The other woman nodded in agreement. "But, Miss Eliza," Miss Bingley said quickly, "as intimate as Mr. Darcy and I are, I am sure I shall rely on you to help me in furthering my romantic quest where he and I are concerned." "Whatever do you mean?" "I mean in the very special way that intimate friends often rely on each other in such a case as this. Sometimes even the most besotted man in the world will take his time in realising the best means of securing felicity in marriage. I fear Mr. Darcy is the rule rather than the exception, if you take my meaning." Elizabeth hesitated. It sounded as though Miss Bingley meant to employ her as a matchmaker. Why on earth would I wish to interfere with Miss Bingley's relationship with Mr. Darcy? Elizabeth asked the other woman as much. "Are we not friends, Miss Eliza? Is that not what friends do? Help each other?" "I suppose there is some truth in that." "Wonderful!" Miss Bingley exclaimed. "I knew I could count on you." As far as Elizabeth was concerned, she had agreed to nothing. Still, she held her tongue. To her way of thinking, appeasing Miss Bingley must certainly work to Jane's advantage where capturing all that remained uncaptured of Mr. Bingley's heart was concerned. Therefore, Elizabeth said nothing more on the subject. Ever the loyal sister, she would merely pretend to go along with Miss Bingley's scheme for Jane's sake. "Should the chance arise for you to sing my praises to Mr. Darcy, I shall count on you to do so with alacrity," Miss Bingley continued. Elizabeth half smiled. "Miss Eliza?" Elizabeth turned and looked at Miss Bingley. "Yes?" "You will remember to keep your promise, I pray. Mr. Darcy likes me, to be sure. However, gentle reminders from those whom he holds in esteem from time to time can only bolster me in his eyes." A bit taken aback, Elizabeth asked, "You suppose Mr. Darcy holds me in esteem?" It was a fair question, to be sure. For most of the time Mr. Darcy and she were in public, they pretended they did not even know each other. Whether she was following his lead or he was following hers, Elizabeth could not say, but the fact remained that they behaved as little more than indifferent acquaintances when others were around. Miss Bingley frowned. "Of course I do. Why on earth would he not? I assure you. Mr. Darcy is far more generous than you must suppose him to be. He is one of the best men I know. I dare say he is the very best, as I am sure you will learn once you get to know him better. Were he not such a kind, loyal and upstanding man, I am sure I would not be half so much in love with him as I am. He really is a gentleman." Elizabeth really did not know what to think of Miss Bingley's glowing assessment of Mr. Darcy. Perhaps she had been too harsh on him since overhearing his uncharitable remark at Lucas Lodge some weeks ago. What was more, he had risked his life to save hers, even though she was still unclear about what really happened between them in the aftermath of her rescue. Miss Bingley took a step forward and reached out her hands for Elizabeth's. "Miss Eliza, there is something I want to say to you. Something I have scarcely ever said to anyone of my own sex before. You are the most kind-hearted person I have ever met. I believe we will become the dearest of friends." Elizabeth stopped and looked at the young woman standing before her. Can this be Miss Bingley? The look on her face was so sincere and full of gratitude that Elizabeth was taken aback. Her initial impression of Miss Bingley had been that she was heartless and cold, precisely the sort of female who ought to stand by Mr. Darcy's side. This picture of the young woman was not only contrary, to every preconceived notion Elizabeth ever held of young women of Miss Bingley's ilk, but it was rather refreshing as well. Refreshing and oddly disturbing. The sceptical part of Elizabeth could not help but wonder if Miss Bingley was so insecure in her status in Mr. Darcy's life that she would resort to flattery and duplicity to ward off potential competitors for the gentleman's affection. Wait, potential competitor? Elizabeth frowned a little at this unlikely depiction of herself. What in the world am I thinking? Miss Bingley turned and walked away, but paused and turned back. Miss Eliza, I just want you to know that I was not raised in a loving home, as you no doubt were. I was taught to disdain anyone whose circumstances in life were less than my own. I have not always understood the true meaning of friendship, but I promise you, Miss Eliza, I will do my best to show you that I can be a most loyal friend. I just want you to know that. Then, with that, Miss Bingley turned and walked away again. She stopped for a second and turned to Elizabeth once more. And one other thing, my dearest Miss Eliza. If you find someone that you are in love with as much as I am in love with my Mr. Darcy, I will be there for you as well, supporting you and celebrating with you. I promise. And then she was gone. Chapter 10. Unrequited Love. One day Miss Bingley approached Elizabeth, taking the latter by complete surprise. The young woman's countenance spoke of some concern. My dear Miss Eliza, what is it? I have not seen you so distracted in all the time I have known you. You look as if something is weighing on your mind. Has something happened? Elizabeth did not think she was that easy to read, but she had been so preoccupied that day she forgot to keep up her guard. She felt the colour spread all over her body. She did not want to answer Miss Bingley's question, despite the young woman's apparently genuine concern. Pray tell me your dear sister has not suffered a setback in her recovery. No, Elizabeth began. Jane's health continues to improve. Then what is the matter? Is it about Mr. Darcy? Did you speak with him at last? No. Yes. Well, how exactly does one go about questioning a man regarding matters of the heart that he seems determined to conceal? Elizabeth asked, still flustered by her recent encounter with the said gentleman. Miss Bingley laughed at her friend's consternation. Miss Eliza, I did not know you to be shy. Were one to judge by the intensity of much of the public intercourse between you two, I dare say you might provoke Mr. Darcy into saying anything. Elizabeth blushed hotly. It was true that she had enjoyed sparring with Mr. Darcy at every turn during her stay at Netherfield. But although she had not encouraged him to such attentions, she certainly did not stop him. Elizabeth bit her lip. I hardly think Mr. Darcy would ever confide in me of such matters, and I am content to leave it at that. But Miss Eliza, you know how much I depend on you. Frankly, I have no wish to bother him. Very well, then. If you have no wish to aid me in my quest, the only way to accomplish my goal is to take matters into my own hands. I will need your help, though, and as I see it, there is no reason in the world for you to refuse me. It is high time you put an end to this cat-and-mouse nonsense. What can be more ridiculous than pursuing a man who does not return your affections? Oh, how Elizabeth wanted to shout those very words from the rooftop, thinking finally Miss Bingley would see the light. But she could not. She likened alienating Miss Bingley to ruining Jane's chance for felicity with Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth would never do anything that might harm her dearest sister. What did Elizabeth care if Miss Bingley continued to make a fool of herself on the altar of unrequited love? Miss Bingley patted Elizabeth's hand. Fear not, my friend. I am not disappointed in you. I know better than anyone how hard it is to know what Mr. Darcy is thinking from one minute to the next. I never knew a more confounding human being in my whole life. I suppose his peculiar nature is one of the things I like most about him. However, I shall refrain from burdening you with my frustrations so long as you are mindful that you and I want the same thing. We do, Elizabeth asked, her voice nearly cracking. Indeed we do. We both are eager for Mr. Darcy to announce formally to the world his intention to marry the woman who owns his heart." Elizabeth wished very much for Miss Bingley to go away. In truth, Elizabeth had indeed approached Mr. Darcy at what was supposed to be on Miss Bingley's behest. Actually, Elizabeth had her own reasons for wanting to know Mr. Darcy's true feelings where Miss Bingley was concerned. In truth, she and Mr. Darcy had just recently parted company, which must explain her altered composure. It was a little disconcerting, but she had resolved to wage her campaign the first thing that day. Elizabeth had found him in the library. The library was meant to be a place for reading. Therefore, Elizabeth made some pretence of searching for a book. Her mission accomplished, she sat opposite him and spared no more time at all before getting to the point. "I have heard it said that a single man in possession of a good fortune, very likely, is in want of a wife. And yet your situation belies such a notion." At that, Mr. Darcy raised his brow. "Are you worried about my being single or perhaps the size of my fortune?" "No, sir. I am merely curious to know what makes a man like you desire to marry. And why should this concern you?" "Let me just say I am asking on behalf of a friend." He laughed a little. "A friend, say you?" Elizabeth closed her book and laid it aside. She clasped both hands and resting them in her lap, she leaned toward him a little. "Mr. Darcy, I suppose you must think me a dreadful person to address you in such a way. It is merely that I thought to be better acquainted with you. Being the curious creature that I am interested in better understanding the character of a man like you." "A man like me?" "Yes, a man like you." He leaned closer. "Miss Elizabeth, I never thought you would ask me such a question, and certainly not in this manner. I had intended to broach such a topic with you soon. It has taken some time before I could bring myself to tell you the truth. You see..." Not wanting their conversation to veer off course, Elizabeth interrupted. "Are you in love with Miss Bingley, Mr. Darcy?" Mr. Darcy was not ready for such a question, but the look in Elizabeth's eyes spoke to her sincerity. As her supposition could not be true, he tried not to laugh. "No," he answered. "I am not in love with Miss Bingley." "Is that the reason you questioned me about marriage? I would never dream of wishing to marry such a woman. It is not that I do not respect her, but—" Here he hesitated, but Elizabeth did not look away, not even for a second. For that he would give her the rest. "I am afraid that she has convinced me to feign an attachment to her as a pretence that served my purposes very well in the past. Her own purposes are rather less clear to me, but as fate would have it, I now realize that I ought never to have allowed it once you had come into my life. Please, Mr. Darcy, tell me you did not deliberately attempt to deceive me." "Can you forgive me, Miss Elizabeth? I have given you a false impression, but I assure you it is only in this matter. Miss Bingley is indeed a close acquaintance. I dare not deny it, but she is certainly not my ideal choice. I confess I like her very well, but I do not love her. But what of you, Miss Elizabeth? Do you fancy yourself in love with me, perhaps?" "Heavens, no," she exclaimed and then eased away from him. Mr. Darcy was surprised by her answer. He meant only to test her mettle. Nevertheless, he was intrigued by the way she sought to hold out on him. He knew he had the power to get the truth from her, for if she did not fancy herself in love with him, why did her conduct toward him suggest otherwise? "So, Miss Elizabeth, were I to propose to you at this very moment, am I expected to believe you would refuse me? Mr. Darcy, either you mean to test me or to taunt me or both, but it is of no use. I certainly do not believe there is any merit in marrying for anything less than love. While I suppose I can agree that many marriages begin without there ever being any consideration of love, I personally do not ascribe to such notions. You have a rather decided opinion on the subject, Miss Elizabeth. Should I believe your resolve to be unshakable?" "Undoubtedly," replied Elizabeth. "Call me foolish or imprudent, if you will, for believing as I do, but you shall not sway me from my opinion." "I believe I can sway you." "You would say something like that, sir." "You and I have known each other as more than indifferent acquaintances, have we not?" "I have never said that we have not." Before Elizabeth could say more, he interrupted. "Have we not known each other as lovers would?" "I would not say that." The idea of Miss Elizabeth Bennet refusing his hand seemed so ridiculous that Mr. Darcy almost laughed. "Are you saying you would not entertain a proposal of marriage from me should I offer you my hand this very moment?" "Heavens, no," she repeated. "Let us be clear. No, you would not entertain an offer of marriage, or no, you would entertain such an offer." "Mr. Darcy, you know perfectly well what I am saying. Stop playing word games with me." She blew out a flustered breath. "What am I to do with you, sir?" Meanwhile, Mr. Darcy was alone in another part of the house, entertaining thoughts of his earlier encounter with Elizabeth. Her words lingered in his mind. "What am I to do with you, sir?" Did Elizabeth even know what she already did to him? He was completely in her power, and she acted as though she did not realize it. He had seized Elizabeth by her arm and pulled her into his lap. "What say we play another game?" He had held her tight and kissed her passionately without thought. He held her as though he loved her. Was he in love with her? Was it possible she did not love him back? Was this the truth or merely her misguided sense of loyalty to her supposed friend? Darcy had not meant to kiss Elizabeth so passionately, but his body had betrayed him. He had never planned to love her. He had done that without thought. Yet he had kissed her again. And she kissed him. Neither of them was angry or reproachful, and suddenly her lips were all that he could think of. He had wanted to claim Elizabeth for himself for all time. He wanted everything with her, even though it was clear he could have nothing, nothing beyond that moment in that space and that time. Whatever his earlier intentions may have been, whether to test or to taunt, what he wanted at that moment was to hold her in his arms and enjoy whatever stolen pleasures she would allow. Then he had felt her push against him, and he felt her hands gripping his hair. He kissed her again, slowly, tenderly, yet full of need, savouring the taste and feel of her lips and her mouth. There was no other sensation in his life that he could compare it to. And they went on in that manner for endless moments before her reason no doubt overtook her desire, and Elizabeth hastily quit the room. Chapter 11. Without Conscious Thought. Some hours later, Mr. Darcy was staring out the window when Elizabeth came into the drawing room. Tall and slender, all his masculine beauty was on display even from behind. Her heartbeat sped up. He had a way of confounding her as much as ever. What had happened between them in the library earlier played out over and over in her busy mind. And, as ever when being with him either in person or in her thoughts, her body had betrayed her. As she felt his lips on hers, she was caught up in his embrace. Without conscious thought, she could not help but kiss him back. The last thing she needed was to find herself alone with him again. Seeing that there was no one else in the room, she meant to turn around and leave. "Miss Elizabeth." The sound of his voice made her stop. His hands clasped behind his back, he said, "I apologize for my behavior earlier. I assure you it was not my intention to distress you." Visions of her own behavior flashed before her eyes, and she wanted to feel guilt for her part, but it felt so right while it was happening. At a proper distance, it felt improper. In the moment, being with him felt like it did the first time he held her in his arms. "However inappropriately you came to me, I believe your intentions were genuine." He must have heard her footsteps as she came deeper inside the room, but he continued to stare out the window. "You came to me with good intentions, and I, in turn, behaved badly." Her silence likely encouraged him to turn and face her. His eyes dark, his voice deep and resonant, he said, "May I prevail on you to take a walk with me?" There is much I would say to you. Only not here. Perhaps a breath of fresh air will do both of us some good." "Yes, sir," she said, heedless of what she was about. Elizabeth went to gather her bonnet and don her spencer, and then met Mr. Darcy outside. The sweet smell of the garden and the sun beaming on her face made for a refreshing change indeed. After walking through the garden path for several minutes in silence, Mr. Darcy had all but closed the entire distance between them. He further took Elizabeth by the hand, bent his elbow and tucked her hand inside. Elizabeth knew not what to make of such a gesture. This man was not an intimate acquaintance. He was not a man who courted her, despite the fact that their conduct in privacy suggested otherwise. The way he kissed her, held her, and even looked at her was becoming far too familiar to her, albeit invigorating, exhilarating. She was growing more and more in danger of him, finding herself helpless to deny him, helpless to deny herself. Was not the purpose for their walk in the park to avoid such temptations? Silently balking, she withdrew her hand from his arm and clasped both her hands behind her back. She eased a bit farther apart from him for good measure. "What is it that you wanted to say to me during this walk, Mr. Darcy?" "It pertains to the bold question you asked me earlier." "Unless I am mistaken, I was not the only one to pose bold questions, sir." "Pray refresh my memory, Miss Elizabeth. Did I pose a bold question to you as well?" Darcy asked. "What was it?" "As you are patently aware of my bold question, you cannot possibly have forgotten your own." He laughed a little. "Very well, Miss Elizabeth. For you, as always, have the advantage of me." Elizabeth silently scoffed. She did not know about that. "Again," Mr. Darcy continued, "I want to apologise to you for my earlier behaviour. You wished to know the truth about my feelings for Miss Bingley. You spoke honestly and frankly about your own feelings on the subject of matrimony, and what did I do but try to turn the tables on you, to test your conviction? It was wrong of me to do so. The truth is, I have spent far too much time trying to avoid marital schemes to give it any serious consideration." "Now who is playing cat and mouse games?" Elizabeth wondered, thinking of the merry chase between Miss Bingley and the gentleman and likening it to their own situation. "Well, I, for one, will not be a willing participant, not any more, even if I do long to be in Mr. Darcy's arms," a part of her whispered in silence. "Perchance you have forgotten another part of our earlier conversation, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth retorted. "If I recall correctly, you asked me if I thought we should forget all the obligations of our stations, continue to flaunt decorum, and go on doing exactly as we please, with no regard for the feelings of others." Mr. Darcy paled. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but was prevented from doing so when Miss Bingley, to his seeming vexation, appeared from nowhere and wedged her way in between Elizabeth and him. "Well, if it is not two of my favourite people," she said, lacing her arms with theirs. Elizabeth could not help but observe the alarm in Mr. Darcy's eyes. His face, with its perfect chiselled features, looked exactly as she hoped it would. Her question unsettled him, and she could not be more pleased. How dare he taunt her with a supposed offer of marriage and then pretend it were nothing? Even though it really was nothing and she knew it at the time, that was not the point. What if I had said yes? "Miss Bingley, Miss Elizabeth and I are in the middle of a conversation," said Mr. Darcy. "Unless the two of you have secret affairs to discuss, which I know you do not. What is the problem in my joining you? The three of us have rarely spent time in one another's company like this." "And I am afraid this will not be one of those times," said Elizabeth. "I was just about to turn and head back to the manor house. I wish to spend time with my sister Jane." "Miss Elizabeth, I am sure Miss Bingley will happily fill in as your walking companion, sir." As though wanting to vex him further, she added, "As intimate as the two of you are, no doubt she will do the job admirably." "Of course I will. For what else do I live other than to be of service to you, Mr. Darcy?" Miss Bingley asked. batting her eyelashes at him. "I beg your pardon, Miss Bingley. Miss Elizabeth and I are having a discussion." "Unless you are speaking of me, what does it signify? That is unless—" She halted her speech and looked at Darcy, then Elizabeth, and then back at Darcy. She shook her head, no doubt dismissing the possibility of anything untoward occurring between the two of them. While Mr. Darcy's patience with Miss Bingley and all her pretensions was growing thin, he still cared for her. As much as he wanted to dismiss her and resume his troubling conversation with Elizabeth, he could not. Perhaps the greater conversation to be had at that moment was to remind Miss Bingley that their so-called attachment was no more than a ruse, that the time had come to put an end to it. On the other hand, Elizabeth's words were equally disturbing to him. She knew he had never expressed those words she accused him of saying. Why would she suggest such a thing even in jest? Is this her retribution for my mock offer of marriage? Darcy was so absorbed in his silent conjecture, he missed seeing Elizabeth walk away. He called out to her. She stopped and turned to look back at him, her expression unreadable. "I shall look forward to seeing you at dinner." She smiled at him. "Indeed, sir, I would by no means wish to suspend any pleasure of yours." When it was just the two of them, Darcy chastised Miss Bingley for her overzealousness. Though he remained silent on the subject, he knew she had pressured Elizabeth into doing her bidding. Even though he could not understand why Elizabeth went along with the scheme. "Women! Upon my word, Mr. Darcy," Miss Bingley cried, feigning wounded pride, "what are you saying? Are you suggesting you do not love me?" The riled gentleman rolled his eyes and released a deep, frustrated breath. Moments later, he could be seen storming through the garden path. Alone. Well, not entirely alone. Miss Bingley trailed some distance behind at a hurried pace with her skirt raised just enough to prevent her tripping over her hem. "Oh, Mr. Darcy," she exclaimed with energy, "wait for me." Chapter 12. Influencing his felicity. Jane was well on her way to a complete recovery. No one could be unhappy about that except maybe Mrs. Bennet, who had made it perfectly clear to her eldest daughter the true aim of the visit to Netherfield when she herself made a visit there. Indeed, Jane was well enough to spend time in the company of others outside her apartment and even take a short walk in the garden with her Mr. Bingley. "I am glad to hear that you are well enough to take some walks outside. I am feeling much better with each passing day, thank you. It is a shame that you have been confined to your room for so long. You should be outside as much as possible. It is the best way to get better." "I know." Jane was not looking at Mr. Bingley. She was looking back over the garden. The garden was lush and lovely even during that time of year. Everything so vibrant. "I like it out here," she said wistfully. "It pleases me to hear you say so," said Mr. Bingley. "It has been such a pleasure having you here." The gentleman coloured. "That is not to say I am pleased that you have been ill. What I meant was—" Jane reached out her hand to the befuddled young man. He seized it in his. "I know exactly what you meant, sir. You have taken such prodigious care of me during my stay. I find I am quite in your debt. How shall I ever repay your kindness to me?" "Your lovely smile is all the thanks I shall ever require, Miss Bennet." Jane stifled a laugh. "Mr. Bingley, sir, I am sure I am capable of doing more than just that." The two of them went on in that way until it was time for Jane to return to her room. What a pleasant outing indeed after being confined in her apartment for so long. The first of many to come if Jane had her way, Charlotte's sage advice uppermost in her mind. The Bennet sisters' time at Netherfield was finally drawing to a close. Darcy was sure he was more pleased than disappointed by this news, feeling as he did that Elizabeth had been there long enough. He could never recall a time in his life when he had been so bewitched by any woman. Making matters worse, Miss Bingley was clingier than ever. Darcy surely had grown tired of that. And what is it with her so-called friendship with Elizabeth? The whole thing did not sit right with him, for Miss Bingley never liked any woman who showed the slightest bit of interest in him, and he knew by then that Elizabeth was interested in him. A man knew such things. Why else would she taunt and tease him so mercilessly when they were in company with others? Was she truly oblivious to what she did to him? Elizabeth drives me utterly mad with desire. A troubling thought occurred to him. In rising to Elizabeth's every challenge, had he elevated her with the hope of influencing his felicity? That would never do. If I recall correctly, you asked me if I thought we should forget all the obligations of our stations, continue to flaunt decorum, and go on doing exactly as we please, with no regard for the feelings of others. Elizabeth's bold words weighed heavily on his heart and mind. How telling her words were. True, he had not uttered anything of that nature, but actions had a way of speaking louder than words. How fortunate for him that Elizabeth was too headstrong to take the bait when he jokingly proposed offering her his hand in marriage. Despite being a single man, the last thing he was in want of was a wife. A lover, perhaps, but most definitely not a wife. Sensible that if such an idea had been suggested, his behaviour during her past days at Netherfield surely had material weight in crushing it. He had scarcely spoken 10 words to her since they parted in the garden days earlier. That afternoon, however, found the two of them alone in the library. Again. So this is to be my test. The ticking clock steadily confirmed the passing time. Darcy had to admit things were going pretty well. They sat a respectable distance apart for a start. Elizabeth seemed just as bent on not talking to him as he was on not talking to her. He adhered most conscientiously to his book and would not even look at her. After a while, however, a sound at the far end of the room near the stacks drew his attention. He looked up from his book only to see Elizabeth had climbed to the highest rung of a ladder trying to reach a book, and she was braced for an inevitable fall. Tossing his book aside, he raced over to catch her. Elizabeth was back in his arms again. The two spoke not a word. They did not need to, for everything they had been feeling for days poured forth, and a fiery, passionate onslaught ensued. Until suddenly Darcy stopped and pulled away. "Miss Elizabeth," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him inquiringly. "We have to stop." "I know," she said, her voice breathy and low, and the sound of it nearly ripped his heart to shreds, as though he really wanted her to say something else. His lips touched her cheeks and forehead as he pressed her tightly to himself. As much as it pained him, he said, "This cannot happen again." "I know." Elizabeth had escaped the manor house for a solitary ramble about the park when Miss Bingley accosted her. She greeted Elizabeth with a warm smile and turned to walk with her. "I understand Mr. Darcy and you spent time in each other's company this afternoon," said Miss Bingley. A little taken aback, Elizabeth asked, "How would you know that?" Miss Bingley shrugged. "Why, he told me, of course. I asked him where he had disappeared to, and he said he was in the library. With you." She seized Elizabeth's arm. "I know how much the two of you dislike each other. I must apologize for having neglected you. Pray you will forgive me." "I did not feel the least bit neglected, I assure you." "Of course not. I know how fond you are of reading. I would say that is the one thing you and my Mr. Darcy have in common. But I dare say that reading could not have been your only mode of passing the time. Surely the two of you must have engaged in some manner of intercourse. Did you speak with Mr. Darcy on my behalf as I asked?" "No, I am afraid I did not." "Oh, Eliza. Well, what did the two of you discuss?" "I am afraid very few words were exchanged between us, certainly nothing to entertain." Miss Bingley sighed. "Whatever am I to do with you? You know how much I depend on you to nudge Mr. Darcy into doing what he ought to do. I suppose if I am to have the satisfaction I seek, I must lock the two of you in a room for a couple of hours, and then you will have no choice but to do my bidding." Elizabeth said nothing, and Miss Bingley went on in that manner until they reached the house. For Elizabeth's part, she could not wait to get away from the besotted young lady. She needed time to think. She did not know whether she was hopeful or fearful over the idea of spending 2 hours alone with Mr. Darcy, but she was sure the last thing she would be doing if such a scheme unfolded was Miss Bingley's bidding. Miss Bingley, she thought, rolling her eyes. If she could feel sorry for the young woman, then she would. If she could feel guilty for what she had done, she would have done so too. Elizabeth, however, suffered neither of those sentiments. Her mind was busily engaged with what had earlier transpired between Mr. Darcy and her in the library, and she was certain it would be for some time to come. Chapter 13. A Compromising Position. For reasons Elizabeth could not fathom, she received a summons to Miss Bingley's apartment at the time when their party usually dressed for dinner. Elizabeth could only suppose the young woman wanted her advice on what she should wear that evening to best capture Mr. Darcy's attention. By now, Elizabeth was sure Miss Bingley could parade herself before the gentleman wearing nothing at all, and she would not get a rise from him, not even an eyebrow. As for Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth knew his apartment was directly across the hallway from Miss Bingley's. She knew this because Miss Bingley often made a point of telling her. Part of Elizabeth hoped the gentleman kept his door locked at night. Another part of her desperately hoped she would not encounter him in the hallway while on her way to meet Miss Bingley. Not only was there never to be a repetition of the events that unfolded in the library, but the two rarely even exchanged glances. How could they? Especially if he was suffering the same memories of being in each other's arms in that way as she was. Being with him was all she could think of. Thankfully, the renowned reserve that others associated with Mr. Darcy was now on heightened display with Elizabeth. Elizabeth was poised to knock on Miss Bingley's door when an unsettling noise pierced the halls. She turned and looked and could not help but notice that Mr. Darcy's door was ajar. She heard another sound. Had something happened to Mr. Darcy? Elizabeth was too curious not to hurry across the hallway, push open the door and poke her head inside. Poor Miss Bingley was collapsed on the floor, and Mr. Darcy was bending over her with his hands clutching either of her arms. Elizabeth gasped aloud, drawing the couple's notice. She immediately averted her eyes to another part of the room. She almost gasped again when her eyes landed on the little sailboat situated on the mantel as though that were its rightful place. Darcy's eyes followed Elizabeth's, and the disturbance in his mind was almost visible when their eyes met each other's. Miss Bingley, too occupied with her own interests, missed the tense exchange. Instead, she got up from the floor and raced to Elizabeth's side. She coaxed Elizabeth inside the room. The frantic young woman desperately pleaded her case. There was only one thing to be done in such a situation as this. Everyone knew that. If a single man and a single woman were ever to be caught in a compromising position, a speedy trip to the altar must soon follow. "I saw nothing," Elizabeth declared, backing toward the doorway with her hands outstretched in front of her. "What do you mean you saw nothing? Why, you saw everything. You just bore witness to a most scandalous exhibition between Mr. Darcy and me. Why, I shall be ruined if my brother or society in general finds out before he and I are married." "What would you have me do?" Elizabeth cried. "Why, you must go and tell my brother what you saw. You must attest to having seen Mr. Darcy and me in each other's arms, practically making love. Charles will believe it if he hears it from you. Otherwise, it would be my word against Mr. Darcy's. You and I both know how obstinate Mr. Darcy can be, especially where the prospect of marriage is concerned. I will lose my chance of marrying the man I love. You must help me." "I am afraid, Miss Bingley, I can be of no service to you." "Again, I saw nothing," Elizabeth repeated. "That is to say, nothing other than my sailboat. What is my sailboat doing in Mr. Darcy's apartment, on Mr. Darcy's mantel?" she silently screamed. "I must take my leave, Miss Bingley," Elizabeth said, by now standing in the doorway. She threw a glance at the only other occupant in the room. Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth was gone directly. Once Elizabeth was gone, Darcy exhaled a deep breath he had not realised he was holding. What must she think of my having her sailboat in my possession? Would she even believe me if I told her that I found it at the pond and that I meant to return it to her after I repaired it? He shook his head. Who am I fooling? I was never going to return it to her. How can I when it is the only thing I have to remind me that meeting her that fateful day at the pond, rescuing her and making love to her was not a figment of my imagination? Miss Bingley's complaints pierced his silent deliberations. Mr. Darcy, have you not heard a word I have said? What is it now? He almost yelled. Then the memory of what she had done came rushing back to him. That little minx had entered his apartment uninvited, seen him sitting in a chair by the window in deep contemplation of his last encounter with Elizabeth, and, without warning, thrown herself into his lap. Then, when he abruptly stood, and she landed on the floor with a loud thump, she had the audacity to scream. It was as though she wanted the entire household to know what had happened. In point of fact, why was Miss Elizabeth just outside in the hallway at the precise moment Miss Bingley yelled out? He asked Miss Bingley as much. Why do you think she was there? I meant for her to see us together. Why? Well, it is simple. Sometimes I think you pay more attention to Miss Eliza than you do to me. I know I have no reason to be jealous, but I cannot always help it. I know you would never entertain any serious intentions towards someone like her. Still, you are a very attractive man, and what woman would not be misled into thinking she might stand a chance? Not that Miss Eliza would think that way, but now that she has witnessed the two of us behaving as lovers do, she will know how committed we really are to each other. Darcy combed his fingers through his hair, wanting to calm himself before he spoke. At length he said, I like you. Else I would never have tolerated this little ruse for so long. But you go too far. You have to stop this nonsense. How many times must I tell you that I do not feel the way you would like toward you? I care for you, but I do not love you. I will never marry you. Miss Bingley silently scoffed. Did Mr. Darcy really think she would give up so easily? She had been his faithful companion for so long. She had stood by his side, thwarting the hopes and dreams of silly young girls aspiring to have what was rightfully hers. Miss Bingley had put in the work, and she meant to collect her reward. What does love have to do with anything? Miss Bingley cried. I know you well enough to know that when it comes time for you to choose a bride, love will not factor into your equation one iota. When that day comes, I will be waiting for you. No. She placed an index finger in either ear. Not no, Mr. Darcy, but yes, and I will not entertain another word to the contrary. With that, she hurried from the apartment, humming a merry tune to drown out the gentleman's every possible retort. Miss Bingley was nothing if not persistent. Mr. Darcy represented everything she could possibly desire in a husband. Not only was he blessed with all the best parts of beauty, but he was wealthy and of noble blood. Pemberley, his beautiful home in Derbyshire, was her idea of just what her future home ought to be. In her mind, she was the best possible match for Mr. Darcy, and soon everyone else would feel that way too. Chapter 14. The Next in Line. Jane and Elizabeth returned to Longbourn and found that life as they had come to understand it had taken on a whole new meaning. Longbourn had a new house guest. His name was Mr. William Collins. Visitors to Longbourn were not new to them. However, in the case of this particular guest, he had come with a specific purpose in mind. He meant to choose a wife from among the 5 Bennet daughters. He reasoned it was the only thing he could do to rectify any harm caused by the entail on the estate, making him the next in line to inherit. He was tall, plain-looking, and smartly dressed. He had an air about him that suggested that he was puffed up with foolish pride. He spoke eloquently, although in a practised, well-scripted way. It surprised few upon learning he was a vicar in a small parish, and fewer still were impressed. When one was on the receiving end of his attention, One generally wished to be anywhere else but there. Mrs. Bennet welcomed the guest with a mixture of elation and reservation. She did not like the proprietary air with which he looked at and spoke of her home. However, his intention to choose one of her daughters as his bride surely meant that Longbourn would continue to be her home for the rest of her days. What was there not to like about that? And so the next several days found Mrs. Bennet moving about in the most deliberate way, not wanting to take anything for granted. For instance, any designs the man might entertain toward Jane needed to be squelched right away, for Jane was already spoken for. Mrs. Bennet's design was to have him focus on her daughter, who was next to Jane in age as well as in beauty. Mr. Collins, therefore, spent most of his time with Elizabeth, leaving Kitty and Lydia especially alone. However, he did interact with Mary, who, much to the contentment of her siblings, was a more capable and friendly companion. Her insightful conversation and learning led Mr. Collins to become quite fond of her. However, after a few days, Mr. Collins decided that he would have Elizabeth for his bride. Mrs. Bennet was prepared for that move and was, indeed, thrilled. Although she could not reveal the full extent of her joy to her daughter, who was destined to be Mr. Collins' bride out of concern, Elizabeth would be reluctant to embrace such a scheme. She exercised no such reservations when sharing her joy with her friend, Lady Lucas. Lady Lucas could not help but notice the extra spring in Mrs. Bennet's step since the arrival of Mr. Collins, though her first reaction was one of jealousy. True, Mrs. Bennet had 5 daughters to get rid of, and Lady Lucas only had 2, but must the Bennet girls claim every unmarried man who came into the county? First, Mr. Charles Bingley for Jane, and now Mr. William Collins for Elizabeth. Where was the justice in that? Despite whatever marital scheme her mother was concocting, Elizabeth had other plans for how she wished to spend her time and with whom she wanted to spend it. None of such plans included her ridiculous cousin. Were the fates playing a cruel trick on her? Surely this was not the man with whom she was meant to spend her life. What about her knight, who was to ride in on his white horse and carry her off to lands far, far away? I can think of many ways to describe Mr. Collins. Pompous, self-important and toadyish are among the words I would choose. Gallant, romantic and charming most certainly are not. Wanting to get away from Longbourn, her matchmaking mamma, and most of all her would-be suitor that particular day, Elizabeth headed for the pond on the outskirts of the estate. She had not gone there in a while, and for obvious reasons. Despite what happened the last time, she could have no reason to suspect she would meet with any perils that day. She thought of her lost sailboat, which of course led to thoughts of the gentleman at Netherfield. She recalled seeing her sailboat in his room. How did that come about, she wondered. Had Mr. Darcy returned to the pond and happened on it by accident? He had to know it was her rightful property. Her name was etched on the bottom for anyone to see, Lizzy. Elizabeth decided not to think too much about it. Perhaps she would inquire about it the next time she saw him, or maybe not. As much as she wanted her property returned to her, she did not dare risk a complete loss of her virtue, such that it still was. The two of them made for a dangerous concoction whenever they were together. One minute they might be discussing something as threadbare as the weather, and the next, who was to say what manner of intercourse might ensue? She was more than happy to be away from Mr. Darcy and all the temptations he posed. But that does not mean I do not miss seeing him, a part of her whispered. Elizabeth knew it was best to ignore that part of her. She was almost at her destination when the sight of the object of her musings halted her in her tracks. Mr. Darcy must have been of the same mind as she was, for there he sat by the pond, with his back against a tree trunk, his long legs splayed out in front of him and crossed at his ankles. He was reading a book. Her own book landed at her feet. Her heart raced. She could not be there. What if he noticed her? Approached her? She did not trust herself to predict what might happen next. Elizabeth did not mean to find out. She bent to retrieve her book and, careful not to draw any attention to herself by startling his horse that grazed nearby, she backed away slowly, slowly. And when she could, she turned on her heel and hurried away. She did not think he had seen her, but just to be safe, she ducked behind a tree and watched him. He turned his head in her direction and then looked away. No, he did not see her. Still she waited. Still she watched him. She rarely had the chance to observe him at such leisure. He was a beautiful man. There could be no doubt about that. His thin face, his dark hair that fell in lovely waves across his forehead, his fine straight nose, full lips, and cleft chin. His tall and well-formed figure evidenced his excellent horsemanship. At length Elizabeth rested her hand on her bosom. She felt her breath come in waves. What am I doing? I should not be spying on Mr. Darcy, but she could not look away. Chapter 15. From a distance, Mr. Darcy leaned against a large shaded tree nearby the pond, his discarded jacket and black hat lying on the ground beside him. The air carried the aroma of wildflowers and warm earth, and Mr. Darcy breathed deeply of it. An occasional ray of sun peeked through the tree's wide canopy. It was a perfect day. Thoughts of Elizabeth were heavy on his mind and filled his dreams. He always dreamed of her, day and night, so why should that moment prove an exception, especially as it was the site where he first laid eyes on her? Drifting in and out of his light midday slumber, he dreamed on. Standing by the fireplace in Netherfield's library, Darcy held Elizabeth in his arms. "What do you want?" he whispered. "Make me yours," she answered. He needed no more encouragement. A faint sound drew Darcy's eyes open and he saw someone approaching from a distance. It was Elizabeth. She wore a deep green dress that accentuated her tanned skin. For a while he watched and admired her slender figure from afar. She was close but had not seen him. He picked up his book and thumbed through the pages. He breathed a deep sigh of relief upon seeing her turn and walk away. Had she seen him after all? Was that her reason for leaving? He would have congratulated himself on his resolve to stay away from her, except that he noticed the page he was pretending to read was upside down. How embarrassing that would have been had she come to him. She would have seen through his pretenses right away. The wish to stop Elizabeth had been strong, painfully so. All he wanted to do was be with her. But by what right was he to do so? "If I recall correctly, you asked me if I thought we should forget all the obligations of our stations, continue to flaunt decorum, and go on doing exactly as we please, with no regard for the feelings of others." Darcy simply could not get those words out of his head. It was her way of rebuking him, and rightfully so. However, her words also awakened in him his new resolve. Either I will offer Elizabeth my hand in marriage, and seriously the next time, or I shall leave her be forever. Chapter 16. A Measure of Sophistication. When the ladies of Longbourn had called on Netherfield during Jane's convalescence, the two youngest Bennet daughters had prevailed on Charles Bingley to give a ball. He readily agreed to do so once the eldest Bennet daughter had fully recovered. At first, Miss Bingley had thought the silly girls presumptuous, but soon enough she recognised the scheme's merits. She grew more excited about the upcoming ball by the day, not because she looked forward to the prospect of the locals traipsing all over Netherfield, but for very different reasons. While she took great pride in hosting such an event, she also realised all her brother's neighbours were frankly unsophisticated and severely wanting for the finer things in life. Wanting to enliven the occasion with a measure of sophistication, Miss Bingley landed on the idea to dance the waltz with Mr. Darcy. She even went so far as engaging a master from town to come to Netherfield to teach members of her circle the more refined techniques of the dance. More specifically, to teach Miss Bingley her sister, Mrs. Hurst, Miss Bennet, and Miss Elizabeth, assuming the latter could be prevailed upon to join them. By now, Miss Bingley was not sure where her friend's thoughts tended. To her, Elizabeth was as stubborn as Mr. Darcy. Maybe it was not Miss Bingley's finest moment when she tried to elicit Elizabeth's help in forcing Mr. Darcy's hand. But she was growing anxious. She knew him well enough not to give his claims of not wishing to marry her too much credence. What gentleman of sense and education willingly confessed his intention to forfeit his bachelorhood before he absolutely had to? To her vexation, Miss Bingley had no success in persuading Mr. Darcy to join in on the waltz lessons. However, with a bit of prodding, she supposed she could convince her brother to speak to Mr. Darcy and prevail upon the latter to join them. Her brother put her mind at ease with hints that Darcy was more likely than not to excel in the dance, what with his being so worldly. Bingley further added, "Darcy is most accomplished in dancing. I would not worry were I you. I pray you are correct for dancing the waltz with Mr. Darcy is my sole purpose for organising this scheme," Miss Bingley opined. Mr. Darcy's absence left Bingley, Mr. Hurst, Mrs. Hurst, Miss Bingley, Miss Bennet, and, albeit reluctantly, Miss Elizabeth as the principal dance students. With Mr. Wyndham Squire's reputation as a waltzing master, no doubt all eyes would be on them. He announced at the start of their first lesson, "It is a simple matter to dance. Step forward, step sideways, bring your feet together, step back, step sideways. It is as natural as can be. And whatever you do, try not to step on anyone's toes." The number of female students compared to males compelled Miss Bingley and Miss Elizabeth to take turns partnering with Mr. Squires. Watching him demonstrate the steps of the waltz with her friend gave Miss Bingley the solution to a potential problem, that being the mismatch of gentlemen and ladies to perform the dance during the ball. In her mind, her brother would pair with Miss Bennet, the Hursts would pair with each other, and, of course, Miss Bingley would pair with her Mr. Darcy. If Mr. Squires could be persuaded to attend the ball, he would be the perfect partner for Miss Elizabeth. They had all been in the drawing-room for some time. The master had insisted on keeping Mr. Hurst on the floor, despite the latter's frequent protests that his shoe was giving him trouble. They had been practicing the dance for a considerable time and were quite tired. However, Miss Bingley, despite her performance, would not be discouraged. She needed to be perfect if she meant to impress Mr. Darcy. "Step, step," he began his instruction again. "It is not so difficult, Miss Bingley." He appeared more than a little frustrated as he stopped and took her hands and pulled her close to him. "Shall we try this again?" The young lady looked him straight in the face and nodded. Miss Bingley was determined to make this work. "Step, step. It is as simple as can be." If only Miss Bingley's efforts were a little more fruitful. Poor Miss Bingley. And yet, again, she did not protest the master's correction. Instead, she learned as best as her ability allowed her, her awkwardness of the steps notwithstanding. Mr. Squires tempered his impatience trying to teach Miss Bingley the waltz. Unfortunately, the ball was in a week, and time was running out for her to get the steps right. "Pray, let us try that again, Miss Bingley, and remember, Rome was not built in a day." Mr. Squires was all for perfection. It would be the same if he were teaching a group of students in his London school or the class in Mr. Bingley's drawing-room. Miss Bingley let out a frustrated sigh. "Very well, sir." Elizabeth sipped her tea as she watched Miss Bingley trying to learn the waltz. By her count, the young lady had stepped on the gentleman's toes no less than 5 times. How fitting that Miss Bingley should be the one to struggle, whereas Jane, Mrs. Hurst, and Elizabeth herself excelled. Mr. Squires had even gone out of his way to praise Elizabeth for being so versed at dancing the waltz, much to Miss Bingley's chagrin. Elizabeth silently considered. It does Miss Bingley good to suffer a little humility after frequently boasting of all the admirable traits a perfect young lady must possess. Elizabeth recalled one such declaration by Miss Bingley. No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. It seems Miss Bingley is not quite as accomplished as she would have others believe. "Why don't we take a few minutes to rest, Miss Bingley?" asked Mr. Squires. "Did I do something wrong again?" "Of course not. It is just that there is only so much abuse one's dance partner's toes can take." Everyone had been practicing so diligently that morning. Taking a break was a welcome reprieve. Elizabeth was not surprised to see her sister and Mr. Bingley quit the room arm in arm. If nothing else, spending so much time in each other's company during the dance lessons had allowed the two of them to get better acquainted. One must not always remain under the watchful eyes of others when courting, even if propriety dictates it. Elizabeth did not always adhere to the strict edicts society was wont to impose. She would not judge others for behaving accordingly, allowing for good sense and sensibilities, of course. The growing affection between their siblings was one area Elizabeth felt herself in Miss Bingley's debt, even though it may have been an unintended consequence, for Miss Bingley only had one true objective in mind, and that was dancing the waltz with Mr. Darcy at the ball. Heaven knows she mentioned it often enough. The gentleman's noticeable absence could hardly be excused so far as Elizabeth was concerned. That is, unless he is merely staying away to avoid seeing me, in which case I applaud his not being here. After the agreed-upon break time had passed, and everyone had returned to the room, Mr. Squires said, "Now that we have all rested, shall we try the last step again?" With Miss Bingley as his dance partner, they commenced going through the dance once more. Mr. Squiers's arms stretched out. His hand reached for the young woman's waist. "Breathe in and out a few times. Then, when you are ready, you will take your right foot and move it like this." Later, Miss Bingley vented her frustration in the hallway with her brother. "If only Mr. Darcy could be bothered to practice with me." The young lady's shoulders quivered as she struggled not to sob. "This is so humiliating. I fear I may be a laughing-stock." She burst into tears. Despite growing up with two sisters, Bingley was powerless to withstand a wailing female. He took his sister in his arms. "There now, Caroline. I am more than happy to practice with you." "But what about Miss Bennet?" "That is to say, when I am not practicing with her. During those times, I am sure her sister Miss Elizabeth will be delighted to partner with you, what with the two of you being such intimate friends. Fear not. Everything will work out as you planned, and you shall have your dance." He patted her back. "Even if all our friends and neighbours are subjected to such a scandalous exhibition." Chapter 17. An Unequal Marriage. Mr. Bennet thought his wife had gotten a little ahead of herself regarding the marriage of their second eldest daughter. He came across her in the parlour one day, peering out the window with a broad smile on her face. He knew that look. Her mind was busily engaged with wedding breakfast fare and the bridal trousseau. His face a map of wrinkles, and his hair and beard speckled with grey and white. Thomas Bennet shook his head. "I would not stake too much of my happiness on the prospect of Lizzie marrying our guest if I were you, my dear." His lady stopped staring outside and turned on her heel to face him. "And why ever not? Lizzie must marry someone, must she not? Why should she not marry Mr. Collins, and one day be the mistress of all this? Why would she not wish to be the mistress of her own home?" Being the mistress of one's own home is what every young lady ought to aspire to. And were we speaking of the other girls, I would congratulate you. She harumphed. "I might wager Lizzie does not differ from any of our other daughters," Mrs. Bennet opined. "But what would be the point?" "You are always giving her the preference," Mr. Bennet scoffed. "They have none of them much to recommend them," replied he, taking a seat in his favourite chair. "They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters. She is the least likely of them all to suffer fools." Her countenance bearing the lines like the frowning face of a child, Mrs. Bennet asked, "Are you suggesting that Mr. Collins, the heir of Longbourn, is a fool and thereby unworthy of her?" Longbourn's matriarch proved to be a woman of mean understanding and little information. Mr. Bennet was an odd mixture of quick parts and sarcastic humour. Unfortunately, 23 years of marriage did nothing to help his wife understand his character. In any other circumstance, he would not take the time to bolster his stance. Still, as Elizabeth was his favourite and his lady had missed his point, he continued, "I am saying I know her disposition. She could be neither happy nor respectable unless she truly esteemed her husband and looked up to him as a superior. Lizzie's lively talents would place her in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. As obstinate and headstrong as she is, Lizzie should consider herself lucky Mr. Collins set his cap on her. She would be a fool to refuse him, especially as she can have no guarantee of ever receiving an offer of marriage from somebody else." As though meaning to vex his wife completely, Mr. Bennet said, "Are we not all fools when it comes to such matters? It is just that kind of thinking that is the problem. I am sure Lizzie would not suffer half so many fanciful notions as you suggest had you not filled her head with such unlikely dreams from the time she was a child. If our daughter ends up being a spinster, I shall remember exactly who to blame." That night Elizabeth suffered a fitful sleep, one wrought with tossing, turning and disturbing dreams. She tried her best to scream, but she could not. There were bubbles, so many bubbles, and then she was floating in water, water that was entirely black. She was gasping for breath. There was something around her neck. Although she was still trying to scream, she could not. She felt light as air, as though her body was being carried by a powerful tide. A strong arm encircled her waist and yanked her beneath the water deeper and deeper. The hopelessness of the situation paralysed her. She was drowning. There was a man. He was touching her. She was lying with him naked. He was the one choking her. "No, I am drowning!" She struggled to this realisation. "I am drowning!" A startlingly familiar voice whispered in her ear. Mr. Darcy's voice. "Hush, hush, my love." Elizabeth gasped and opened her eyes. The gentleman had encircled her in his arms, his strong, loving arms. He peered into her eyes, his face a mixture of concern and relief. "Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth smiled weakly. "Am I dreaming?" He kissed her lips. "I am drowning." Elizabeth gasped for breath. She felt like the air had been cut off from her lungs. Her mind was blank, and she wondered how she could still feel him close to her, how he could have held her still. His fingers were touching her face over and over. "Elizabeth," he whispered. "My dearest Elizabeth." "Sir?" It was all she could say, barely above a whisper. "What happened?" she managed to croak. "You were choking," he answered. "I was choking?" He nodded, then patted her gently on the back. "You are safe now." The blackness receded. Slowly, Elizabeth noticed her clothes had disappeared. "Where are my clothes?" she asked, bewildered. "I removed them. I could not have you catch a chill, could I?" he asked with a smile. "And your clothes, sir?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where are they?" "I removed my clothes as well. Surely you would not have me catch a chill, would you, my love?" "But—" He silenced her protest with a touch of his finger to her lips. "Sleep now, my love." "But our being like this, it's dangerous." "Hush, Elizabeth, it will be all right." He kissed her lips once more. "No one knows about this place. This is our place." Elizabeth woke with a start. She sat up in her bed. She was alone. Of course she was alone. It was but a dream, but a part of her wished she was still asleep, still dreaming. Why was she lying with Mr. Darcy? What might the dream have next entailed? Try as she might not to think of Mr. Darcy during the day in the hopes he would not invade her dreams at night, it was to no avail. And why, pray tell, do so many of my dreams find me drowning? She shook her head. Although most of the time, I feel as though I am drowning in a sea of love, and no matter how much I struggle, the deeper I continue to fall. Elizabeth could not help but wonder if she might throw all caution to the wind, so she might fully explore the intense feelings she suffered for Mr. Darcy while she still had the chance. For a half-second she had entertained the idea of a life with the ridiculous Mr. Collins, of all people for the sake of her family. Not that she would ever have him, but what if the next suitor, assuming there would ever be another, was just as intolerable? What if I never meet a man who excites me the way Mr. Darcy excites me ever again? Chapter 18. A Multitude of Stratagems. The Netherfield Ball. November 26th. Although Elizabeth had spent many hours in that very room practising of late, nothing could have prepared her for the ballroom's splendour that evening. The room was awash in brilliant candlelight, casting a magical air of mystic wonder. It was decorated with ornate gold-tipped candelabras and vases placed strategically about the room, each filled with a beautiful bouquet of lilies. None other than the most enormous crystal chandelier she had ever seen helped illuminate the room. Indeed, the Bingleys had outdone themselves. Of course, Elizabeth had attended her share of private balls. Still, nothing could compare to that evening's promise. Of that she was sure. The opulence of it all, Elizabeth could hardly believe it. Even her ridiculous cousin Mr. Collins, and his insistence that he would remain by her side throughout the night, could not dampen Elizabeth's enthusiasm. She had thought dancing 2 sets with him, along with constant reminders that there were more than a few other ladies in the room in want of dance partners, would send him on his way. But unfortunately, it was to no avail. Thank heavens her intimate friend Charlotte seemed amiable to taking the man off Elizabeth's hands. Once she did, Elizabeth employed a multitude of stratagems to make sure Charlotte could not give him back. Elizabeth was not known for being an excellent walker for nothing. Later that evening, Miss Bingley found Elizabeth standing by the doorway, watching the couples move through the dance. Elizabeth could not recall seeing the young woman so animated. She almost comported herself with the giddiness of a schoolgirl. It is time. Soon the waltz will be called, and I shall have my dance with Mr. Darcy. I am so excited. Elizabeth smiled. She said nothing. Her mind was too busily engaged with thoughts of how everyone at the ball might react upon witnessing such an exhibition. Her concerns were considerably allayed by the fact that Mr. Bingley and Jane were to be partnered. Surely Jane's taking part in the dance must temper anyone's objections. Who would dare accuse Jane of being indecorous? Of course the Hursts would be paired. Miss Bingley would dance with Mr. Darcy, that was, if he finally deigned to make an appearance. Surely he would not disappoint the young lady, despite his refusal to participate in the dance rehearsals. Elizabeth had been half tempted to ask about the gentleman's whereabouts, but she supposed that would have been giving him more consequence than she wished to at the time. The 2 of them had been so diligent in keeping their distance from each other. She did not dare jinx them by thinking about him too much. Returning her thoughts to the anticipated dance, Elizabeth reflected on having the honour of dancing with Mr. Squires, the master himself. Knowing that any mistakes she might make would be rendered inconsequential in the arms of a skilled dancer like Mr. Squires was comforting in and of itself. "Are you not excited?" Miss Bingley asked. Elizabeth could honestly say she was excited, although not nearly as much as Miss Bingley. The 2 young ladies were still standing next to each other when the much-anticipated dance was called. For the first time that evening, Elizabeth saw Mr. Darcy, impeccably dressed as always in finely tailored attire fashioned especially for him. Why must he always have to look so divine? She could not help but wonder. Tall, dark, and handsome, she likened him to a fierce creature, stalking his prey, which in this case just happened to be Miss Bingley. She could only imagine how the other woman must be feeling. She knew the pleasures to be held once captured in this man's arms. She fought hard to repress the memories. The closer he came, the more she remembered. By then he stood mere inches away, poised to pounce. Only his prey was not the other woman at all. Mr. Darcy was stalking Elizabeth. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, standing directly before her, his eyes fixed on hers and hers alone. His hand was outstretched, ready to seize hers. "May I have the pleasure of dancing the waltz with you?" Elizabeth's heart slammed against her chest. Her pulse raced and her knees shook. Saying no to Mr. Darcy would mean denying herself the pleasure of dancing for the rest of the evening. Elizabeth did not want that. She meant to dance the night away. Neither did she want to be a party to Miss Bingley's embarrassment, her wounded feelings, and, yes, her heartbreak. Miss Bingley was standing right beside Elizabeth, her mouth agape and her eyes pooling with tears. Mr. Darcy was standing before Elizabeth, his hand extended, awaiting her reply. Elizabeth felt as though every eye in the room was watching and waiting. In a flash, Mr. Squires, having witnessed all this, and no doubt feeling all the situation's awkwardness, came to Miss Bingley's rescue. He reached out his hand to her. "Miss Bingley," he began, "let us show everyone how this is done." As if remembering herself, the distraught young woman accepted the gentleman's hand with an affected smile. Elizabeth was now free to accept Mr. Darcy's. Moments later, the dance began. Elizabeth really felt terrible for Miss Bingley, just as she would for anyone in such an unenviable position, for the young lady had worked so diligently to make the night a success. Nevertheless, Elizabeth suffered through the dance as best she could by refusing to converse with her dance partner and ignoring the looks of her neighbours. As pained as she was, Elizabeth ignored the questions and suppositions of others as she went through the steps of the scandalous dance with the one person who, for all everyone knew, was somebody else's gentleman. Gone was her firm belief that if one were going to dance with a gentleman, one should at least have the good manners and common decency to be civil to him. Mr. Darcy deserved no such consideration from her after what he had done. What a time for Mr. Darcy to announce his lack of intention toward Miss Bingley to the world. What an unfeeling way to do so. Was this his way of getting back at Miss Bingley for trying to entrap him? Or had something more sensational happened between the two of them to cause him to dismiss her so outright, and at a private ball no less, an eagerly anticipated occasion in which the young lady herself was expected to shine? Elizabeth supposed she would never know, and she was not sure she wanted to know. All she knew was she could not wait until the dance was over. At that point, she meant to get as far away as possible from Mr. Darcy and a very publicly humiliated and likely enraged Miss Caroline Bingley. Chapter 19. Understandably, warranted. Elizabeth paced the library floor. The room was dimly lit, the slow-burning fire its sole source of light. When she heard approaching footsteps, she knew without looking exactly who had entered the room. Mr. Darcy would not have been the haughty, officious gentleman she knew him to be had he not followed her. "Why did you do that?" she yelled, turning on her heel to face him head-on. Mr. Darcy shrugged. "I am no longer interested in hiding the way I feel for you." She stormed to the part of the room where the gentleman stood. "And you chose that particular moment to tell the world. Why at somebody else's expense? For all intents and purposes, everyone in that room believes the two of you are intended for each other." She drew even closer to him, close enough to appreciate all over again just how wonderful he smelled when she was in his arms on the dance floor. She fought against the feelings such proximity entailed. "How dare you behave so injudiciously, exposing me to society's censure and Miss Bingley to its derision for disappointed hopes?" His eyes poring all over her, Mr. Darcy stood firm. "Everyone, Miss Elizabeth? I know I will never marry her. You know I will never marry her, and she knows I will never marry her. So far, I do not see what the problem is." Missing from his voice was some semblance of contrition, thus further fueling Elizabeth's ire. "The problem is, you deliberately set out to humiliate Miss Bingley. Well, congratulate yourself, sir, for you succeeded phenomenally." Mr. Darcy rolled his eyes. "Since when did you become so invested in Miss Bingley's well-being?" "My concern would be the same regardless of which young lady suffered such ungentlemanly behaviour." "Ungentlemanly?" "Yes, ungentlemanly. You knew how hard Miss Bingley worked in preparation to dance the waltz with you. You knew how much she looked forward to it. Yes, Miss Bingley has proven time and again the lengths to which she will go to force my hand. Miss Bingley is the last person in the world whom I would wish to stand here and defend, but even you must admit she did not deserve such treatment, from you of all people. And did I deserve to be subjected to her little ruse in my apartment, the one in which she meant to entrap me with you serving as her witness, no less? No, you did not, which is the reason I refused to play a part in it. Then, once again, I must ask you what the problem with my behaviour this evening in the ballroom was. Perhaps had you not feigned interest in the young woman where there clearly was none, and for so long, none of this would have happened. It is not fair for you to toy with someone's affections as you did with hers. Is it fair that you are toying with me?" "Toying with you, Mr. Darcy? Toying?" "Yes, toying with me, Miss Elizabeth. You know how I feel about you." He pulled her close and their lips met. There was nothing gentle about their kiss. And at length, Elizabeth pulled away. She raised a brow. "I suppose we are both guilty, but whatever the case may be, I cannot go on with you as I did before. Not any more." "That is precisely how I feel too," said Mr. Darcy. "I cannot bear this charade any more. The two of us pretending we are indifferent toward each other, when the truth is all I ever do is think of you. Day and night, night and day, that is all I ever do. I think of you. I think of us being together." "I think of you too, sir. Of us," Elizabeth confessed. She hesitated a moment. "So, where do we go from here?" "Wherever you wish, as long as we are together," he said, seizing her by the arm, collapsing in the nearest seat, and pulling her into his lap. Upon entering the library in a fit of anger, Elizabeth did not expect to find herself in her current predicament, not consciously. But feeling the way she did whenever the two of them were near each other, she could hardly find it in herself to object. "Mr. Darcy," she whispered, peering into his eyes, hers questioning, "it is time." "Did you lock the door?" she asked, pressing her lips against his devastatingly handsome face. "No, I did not," he confessed. "I think we should lock the door." "Then let us lock the door," he said, standing. They made their way over to close the door. He turned the key. "Marry me," Mr. Darcy murmured in between kisses. "Yes, yes, anything you say, so long as you do not stop doing what you are doing." "No, I am serious, Elizabeth. Marry me." Elizabeth freed herself from his arms. Then, standing before him, she asked, "What are you saying, Mr. Darcy?" I love you. Most ardently. I want you. I need you desperately. I never wish to be parted from you from this moment forward." "Mr. Darcy? Just say yes." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "Yes," she repeated. "Elizabeth," he said, sweeping her up in his arms and carrying her to the sofa tucked away behind the stacks. "What are you doing?" His eyes dark and his voice heavy with desire, he said, "I am hoping to pick up where we left off the last time we were here." "Mr. Darcy? As the future Mrs. Darcy, surely that meets with your approval." Elizabeth bit her lower lip, now shy and unsure. She was not so heedless of decorum as to give herself over to Mr. Darcy's power completely, despite frequent bouts of making love with him. A young bride's wedding night was indeed something to be treasured for a reason. Dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, I think you are thinking too much. There are so many pleasures to be enjoyed before our wedding night. I only mean to show you but a few. But do you love me, Elizabeth? She nodded, and then sealed her sentiments with a brush of her lips on his. Finally, she stroked his cheek with her hand. He captured her hand in his and kissed her palm. Then let me love you. Further protest, albeit understandably warranted, would surely be futile. Elizabeth could hardly wait for more, all too familiar with the pleasures they suffered in each other's arms. Dreams of him could only carry her so far. By now, she needed new dreams. Not dreams of drowning in murkiness and confusion, but dreams of surrendering herself over and over to her knight in shining armour. Never would she deny herself again, for anyone's sake. Mr. Darcy was hers and hers alone. Their time alone proved ample enough to sate their pent-up desire for each other. Darcy made love to Elizabeth in so many ways a gentleman could be expected to, being ever mindful to leave no evidence of their tryst. They did have a ball to return to after all, and likely 1,000 questions, be they asked or unasked, to attend. When the time came to return to the ballroom, Darcy held Elizabeth by her hand and they made their way to the library door. Whatever awaited them on the other side they would face together as one. He turned the key and unlocked the door. Then, poised to pull open the door, he dropped his hand and led Elizabeth a few steps away instead. Elizabeth's eyes opened wide when Mr. Darcy kneeled before her. "Sir, what on earth are you doing?" "What does it look like I am doing? I am down on bended knee asking for your hand in marriage." Elizabeth felt her colour rise in remembrance of what had just occurred between them. "I believe that boat has sailed, sir. Have I not already accepted your proposal?" "True enough. But this is meant to be the proposal we speak of for generations to come. And most importantly, what we tell your mother and father should they ask." "If you think we must, by all means, sir. I would by no means wish to suspend any pleasure of yours." "I am depending on that," he said. Then, taking Elizabeth's hand in his and raising it to his lips, he brushed a tender kiss on her knuckles. "Dearest, loveliest Elizabeth," he began. "In vain I have struggled. It will not do. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Please do me the honour of accepting my hand in marriage. Marry me, and make me the happiest man in all of England." Elizabeth, feeling all the emotions of the moment, smiled. She demurred. Her spirits rising to playfulness, she remembered hearing something about the usual practice of elegant females to increase a gentleman's love by keeping him in suspense. She recalled hearing him speak of hating to be teased. Still, Elizabeth decided to do it anyway, despite her earlier claim of not wishing to suspend his pleasure. "Sir," she began in jest, I do not know quite what to say." The library door slammed shut, drawing the young lover's attention. A determined-minded figure approached. "Mamma!" Elizabeth exclaimed in a half-whisper. "You had better say yes," cried Mrs. Bennet, her hands clasped before her bosom, her countenance a mixture of surprise and consternation. "Yes," Elizabeth said, half embarrassed, half confused. How long had her mother been there? Had she heard, or, worse yet, seen anything that ought to concern the lovers? Mrs. Bennet clapped her hands and hurried to her daughter's side. "Thank heavens for that," she embraced Elizabeth. "I thought such happiness as this might never come my way. Our family is saved." Chapter 20. A Considerable Catch. What could excite a mother with 5 daughters to get rid of more than a wedding? Why, it was all Mrs. Bennet could think of from the moment she walked into the Netherfield library and saw her second eldest daughter standing there with none other than Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy himself before her on bended knee. She didn't even think Elizabeth liked the haughty gentleman. She certainly never supposed Elizabeth would entertain a proposal from such a man. And to think Mrs. Bennet had come close to giving her away to Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins was nothing compared to Mr. Darcy, even if he was the heir apparent of Longbourn. That gentleman will just have to settle for another one of my girls. Why, even my Jane if he chooses to give her a second look. Mrs. Bennet was forced to think about what she had just said to herself. Now that Lizzie is engaged to Mr. Darcy, it must surely bode well for Jane's prospects with Mr. Bingley. No, Jane is definitely not a possibility for Mr. Collins now. I shall steer the man in Mary's direction. Mary was the only one of her daughters who could be bothered with the house guest in any way. Mary would do just fine. She told Mr. Collins as much when she saw him that morning. It turned out Mr. Collins had heard nothing of Elizabeth's engagement to Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, the nephew of his noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. He spoke at length of how such a thing had come to be, how the news was likely to be received, and what not. Mrs. Bennet had not come out of her thoughts long enough to hear every word of Mr. Collins's recitation, for she had been too busy thinking of what dishes she might serve to her distinguished future son-in-law, Mr. Darcy. Surely a man of his means must be accustomed to the finest cuisine the continent had to offer. Well, she could not compete with the finest chefs, but she was known for always having a fine table, far more elegant than Lady Lucas's. Perhaps a consultation with her housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, would steer her in the right direction. As for her house guest, her attention was drawn to him when she heard him say, as he was headed out the door, words to the effect that he was not a man to be passed down from one Bennet daughter to the next, as though an alliance with him was something to be taken for granted. He was not a desperate man. He was a considerable catch, and the Bennet family would come to regret treating him so poorly. He was gone directly. "What was that all about?" Mrs. Bennet asked aloud to no one in particular. She merely shrugged and set off for the kitchen to speak with the housekeeper about the night's dinner. Talk of who wore what, who danced with whom, the opulence of the room, the exquisite supper, indeed anything having to do with the Netherfield ball was rendered inconsequential in the wake of Elizabeth's engagement to Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. As Mrs. Bennet could be heard saying, the gentleman was as good as a lord. Elizabeth, Jane and Charlotte were upstairs in Elizabeth's bedchamber discussing Elizabeth's good fortune. "You are very sly, dearest Eliza. I wager no one saw this coming," said Charlotte, which was really saying something, for Charlotte rarely missed a thing, being the shrewd observer that she was. "No one who did not bear witness to the two of you dancing the waltz, that is," said Jane. "Bravo, Jane!" Charlotte exclaimed. Elizabeth's eyes opened wide. "Dearest Jane, whose side are you on?" "I am on the side of true love, to be sure, and if I did not know it before, I certainly know it now. Mr. Darcy is in love with you, so much so that he asked you to be his wife." She took Elizabeth by the hand. "But are you certain this is what you want, Lizzie? You always said you wanted to marry for love, not merely for the sake of convenience. Yes, Mr. Darcy is rich, to be sure, and you shall have many fine carriages, jewels, a house in town. But all those things can mean nothing if you do not love him." "I love him more than you can know," said Elizabeth. "For heaven's sake, ladies, what is there not to love about such a man?" Charlotte interjected. "I can comprehend your going on charmingly when you had once made a start, but what I want to know is, when did you realise you loved Mr. Darcy in the first place?" Elizabeth said, "It is hard for me to say. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew I had begun." What Elizabeth did not say was, she supposed it was the first moment she laid eyes on him, when she recovered in his arms after he saved her from nearly drowning in the pond, or when he first kissed her lips. No, she could not say that even in the company of her dearest sister and most intimate friend. That was their secret, and theirs alone, Mr. Darcy, and hers. As strange as it seemed, she wanted to keep it that way. "I suppose all that remains to be done is for you and your Mr. Bingley to announce your intentions, dear Jane," said Charlotte. "How are you progressing, if I may ask? Perhaps our dear Eliza will confide to you her secret to securing a single young man with an enormous fortune, in record time no less. Then you will know exactly how you should act." "Charlotte!" Elizabeth exclaimed. Charlotte shrugged. "What did I say?" Jane said, "Noted, dear Charlotte. And by that same token, you must seek Lizzie's advice as well. I have it on good authority that our cousin is in want of a wife." Charlotte said nothing. She did not have to. The look on her face said it all. Jane broke the ensuing silence. "Despite my pleasure in seeing you so happily situated, my dearest Lizzie, I would be terribly remiss not to acknowledge Miss Bingley's pain. She had her heart set on securing Mr. Darcy for herself." "Surely you do not think me so heartless as not to feel it too?" Elizabeth cried. "Of course not," Charlotte said. "I wager Miss Bingley never failed to secure anything once she set her heart to it, but alas, such is the nature of unrequited love. One cannot always get what one wants." Elizabeth raised her chin and spoke in a measured tone. "I truly never intended to be the means of thwarting Miss Bingley's favourite wish." "I am sure you did not," Charlotte said. "But when a handsome man like Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy pays you attention, it is difficult to ignore him completely." "Difficult indeed," Elizabeth said wistfully. Charlotte smiled at her friend's evident admiration of her future husband. Elizabeth had always aspired to a love match, and now she had one. On the whole, her friend could never have cause to repine, nor should she worry about the disappointed hopes of a misguided young woman who it turned out was merely crossed in love. Charlotte being ever pragmatic, she told Elizabeth as much. In concluding her sentiment, she took Elizabeth's hand in hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. "A woman who does not seize her own happiness when the opportunity presents itself must forever go through life, having no one else to blame but herself." Truer words, as it turned out, had never been spoken. Chapter 21. Arts and Allurements. In Miss Bingley's case, someone was to blame for her misfortune, and it most certainly was not herself. When the news arrived at Netherfield that Mr. Darcy had gone to Longbourn to work out the marriage settlement with Mr. Bennet, the young woman was furious. A seething storm of anger and disgust. Delicate porcelain figurines, leather-bound books, and expensive vases flew across the room in rapid succession, shattering against the walls. One such object went soaring mid-air, barely missing Bingley's head when the Hursts and he hurried into the room to see what the matter was. They had never seen Miss Bingley in such a fit of rage, her bosom swelling, her eyes blazing. She swore she would do everything in her power to right such an egregious wrong that was done to her. "Come now, Caroline," Bingley said, trying to reason with his sister. "Darcy has never cared for you, not in that way. You have always known that. We all did. So why must you seek vengeance for a perceived injustice that does not concern you at all?" "Of course this concerns me," she replied, her breathing shallow and quick. "Who among our acquaintances in town does not perceive Mr. Darcy as my rightful property? Who among our new neighbours did not believe it as well? Do not pretend you did not see the derision, the pity in their eyes when Mr. Darcy singled out that little upstart Eliza Bennet for the waltz, the special dance I planned, while she and I were standing together no less." In truth, Miss Bingley had simply wanted to fade into the wallpaper in the wake of Mr. Darcy's slight, his betrayal. She was so disheartened, she escaped the room after the dance, abdicating her standing as hostess. The new Empire gown she ordered from town, especially for the occasion, she ripped to shreds. With one act, all her hopes and dreams were destroyed. Why was her own family so insensitive to her plight? "And now you know the reason," said Bingley. "Darcy loves Miss Elizabeth. They are to be married, and the sooner you come to grips with that, the happier you will be." "Happy? Happy? Do you suppose I shall ever be happy when the only man I have ever loved has chosen another? A woman so far beneath him in consequence as to be deemed laughable. I befriended her, invited her into this home frequently, and this is the gratitude I am expected to receive." I do not think you ought to blame Miss Elizabeth for falling in love with Darcy. Anyone who has been paying attention had to have seen this coming, said Bingley. But she was meant to help me win Mr. Darcy's favour. Instead, she betrayed me. She pretended she wanted nothing at all to do with him when she was no doubt using her arts and allurements to entice him behind my back. Mrs. Hurst said, "One cannot befriend a snake and then be surprised when the snake bites one's hand." Miss Bingley glared at her sister. "You are supposed to be on my side," she huffed. "But what must I expect? You are the one who encouraged me to befriend the snake, are you not?" Miss Bingley cried. "I am on your side, sister. However, let us not forget your general suspicion that Mr. Darcy was paying too much attention to Miss Elizabeth was part of the reason you wished to engage her as a potential friend rather than a potential foe. You were sure you would win her over. You tried and you failed. Therefore, I will not allow you to assuage your wounded pride by blaming me." "Wounded pride?" Miss Bingley blew out a frustrated breath. "Wounded pride," the younger woman repeated. "Is that not what I said?" "My wounded pride has nothing to do with this. I love Mr. Darcy. I have loved no one but him. What am I to do now? Quite frankly, my dear Caroline, I suggest you love somebody else. Mr. Darcy, though he was never really yours despite all your pretensions, is lost to you forever." By now it was time to adjourn to the dining room. Mr. Hurst, who was always eager for food and drink, was glad for the reprieve. "Come now, everyone. What say you we put all this madness aside? Caroline, Louisa, speak your apologies and let us enjoy tonight's meal." Everyone headed for the door but Miss Bingley. "Will you please join us for dinner?" Mr. Hurst called out. "You must not risk falling ill." "No," Miss Bingley replied, adding an extra dose of petulance to her voice. "I am sure I shall not be missed. I should think not demanding my presence at the table suits your true preferences perfectly well, being the traitors you all are. I think it more likely that the rest of us are offended by your childishness," Mrs. Hurst said. "Do not think for one moment that anyone has not observed your temper. I would kindly ask that you do not make us all suffer for your disappointed hopes." Miss Bingley folded one arm over the other. "What do I care what the rest of you think? Only hate or loathing of the most despicable kind would compel Miss Bingley to do what she did next. Miss Bingley really hated Elizabeth. She wanted to know why Elizabeth betrayed her, but she despised her too much to ask her. She wanted to accuse Elizabeth of wanting Mr. Darcy all along, speaking to her in the harshest of tones, but the thought of seeing her sworn enemy face to face so soon after the betrayal turned her stomach. The aggrieved lady wanted to do everything in her power to prevent the marriage from ever taking place. If she could not have Mr. Darcy, she surely did not mean to see the woman who had stolen him from her have him. Even if it were true that he would never love her the way she wanted him to, the fact that he loved somebody else was not to be borne. There was but one thing Miss Bingley could do with no trouble to herself at all that would surely give her the justice she needed. So the embittered young lady set off to write a letter, one addressed to the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Kent. Chapter 22. Noble Relations. One day, a little over a week after Mr. Darcy's engagement with Elizabeth had been formed, as she and the females of the family were sitting together in the dining room, the sound of a carriage suddenly drew their attention to the window. They observed a chaise and four driving up the lawn. It was too early in the morning for visitors, and, besides, the equipage did not answer to that of any of their neighbours. The horses were post, and neither the carriage nor the servant's livery, who preceded it, was familiar to them. The conjectures of everyone in the room continued with little satisfaction till the door flew open and their visitor entered. Mr. Collins jumped to his feet and bowed deeply, welcoming the visitor. Her name was Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Elizabeth had heard enough of his approbations of late to know she was his noble patroness, but, more importantly, She was Mr. Darcy's aunt. Her regal demeanour was all Elizabeth expected to see upon meeting her betrothed's noble relations. Still, absent was any measure of gentility one might expect from a new visitor. Instead, once formally introduced, the noble lady threw a dismissive glance about the entire room and refused to take her seat. This was definitely not a social call, and it most certainly was not a visit designed to welcome Elizabeth into the Fitzwilliam family. She insisted upon a private audience with Elizabeth. Accordingly, the two quit the house, and as soon as they entered the garden, Lady Catherine began in the following manner. "You can be at no loss, Miss Bennet, to understand the reason for my journey hither. Your own heart, your own conscience, must tell you why I have come." Elizabeth looked at the noble guest with unaffected astonishment. Then, reminding herself to exercise civility where none, so far, was due, she said, "As your future niece, I can only suppose you came here to welcome me into your family. Let me assure you I am most honoured to receive you." "Miss Bennet," replied her ladyship in an angry tone, "you ought to know that I am not to be trifled with. But however insincere you may choose to be, you shall not find me so. My character has ever been celebrated for its sincerity and frankness, and in the cause of such a moment as this, I shall certainly not depart from it. A report of a most alarming nature reached me a few days ago. I was told that you were on the point of being most advantageously married to my nephew, my own nephew, Mr. Darcy, though I know it must be a scandalous falsehood, and I would not injure him so much as to suppose the truth of it possible. I instantly resolved on setting off for this place that I might make my sentiments known to you." "If you believed it impossible to be true," said Elizabeth, colouring with astonishment and disdain, "I wonder you took the trouble of coming so far. Your presence here belies your supposed stance, does it not? What could your ladyship propose by it? I came here at once to insist upon having such a report universally contradicted." Elizabeth knew not how to think or feel in the wake of such an angry assault. The woman spoke as though interfering in the lives of others was second nature to her. Elizabeth's ire increased with each passing moment. "I am sorry if it disappoints you, but you will hear no contradiction from me," said Elizabeth coolly. "If you believe such nonsense to be possible, then you are the one who is bound to be disappointed. Look around this place. Look at your family, and even yourself. Your lack of fortune and want of connections is plain for everyone to see. My nephew would be a fool to align himself with the likes of you, and you are a fool if you think I will allow one moment of indiscretion on my nephew's part to disrupt the hopes and dreams of his family. Indeed, I know all about what happened. Nothing that concerns my nephew escapes my knowing. I know how you and your sister wangled your way into the good graces of his friends at Netherfield Park. I know how you, in particular, used your feminine arts and allurements to draw my nephew in and to entrap him into a marriage that benefits no one but yourself, you and your near-impoverished family by comparison to my own. If Mr. Darcy has no objections to my family or me, our lack of fortune and want of connections, then why on earth should you?" Lady Catherine released a deep sigh. "It is not merely these things that render you an unsuitable match. It is more than that. This match to which you have the presumption to aspire can never take place. No, never. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. Now what have you to say?" "Only this, that if he were engaged to another, why did he make an offer of marriage to me?" Lady Catherine hesitated for a moment, and then replied, "The engagement between them is of a peculiar kind. From their infancy, they have been intended for each other. It was the favourite wish of his mother, as well as of my own. While in their cradles, we planned the union, and now, at the moment when the wishes of both sisters would be accomplished in their marriage, It is not to be prevented by a young woman of inferior birth, of no importance in the world, and wholly unallied to the family. Do you pay no regard to the wishes of his friends, to his tacit engagement with my daughter? Are you lost to every feeling of propriety and delicacy? Your ladyship, Elizabeth began, despite what you think of me, I am not insensitive to the disappointed hopes of a sister wishing to honour a promise she made to, no doubt, a most beloved sibling. Indeed, I am sorry for your loss. However, the plans of which you speak must surely mean nothing to Mr. Darcy. Why must they hold sway over me? You and his late mother did your part in planning the union. Its execution depended entirely upon others. As I am Mr. Darcy's choice, you have no right to stand before me and browbeat me into submission for the sake of some impossible dream. Lady Catherine's noble mien turned into a threatening scowl. You are mistaken. I have every right for honour, decorum, prudence, nay, interest attest to it. Yes, Miss Bennet, interest. Do not expect to be noticed by his family or friends if you wilfully act against all inclinations. On the contrary, you will be censured, slighted, and despised by everyone connected with him. Your alliance will be a disgrace. Your name will never even be mentioned by any of us. This was no time for Elizabeth to be speechless. However, the thought of gratifying Lady Catherine with silent indignation was sorely tempting. These are heavy misfortunes, replied Elizabeth, but the wife of Mr. Darcy must have such extraordinary sources of happiness necessarily attached to her situation that she could, upon the whole, have no cause to repine. I was told to expect such impertinent obstinance on your part. I did not come all this way empty-handed. Elizabeth had noticed the oversized leather bag her ladyship was carrying, but gave it little thought. That was until Lady Catherine opened it right there before Elizabeth's eyes. The handbag was stuffed to the brim with money, large notes as best Elizabeth could tell. Lady Catherine said, I see that I have your attention. I assure you there is much more where that came from. Name your price, young woman. I am prepared to do whatever it takes to bring you to reason. You have widely mistaken my character if you think I can be worked on by such persuasions as this, Elizabeth said, her anger rising inside. Not so hasty, if you please. I am by no means done. If you do not take the money for yourself, then do it for your sisters. I know enough about your family to know what a pittance all of you have for your so-called dowries. Surely all of you do not plan to entrap wealthy gentlemen with overactive carnal impulses into marriage. What a despicable woman. So haughty, so officious, and so vulgar. You have insulted me in every possible method, Elizabeth resentfully replied. You can now have nothing further to say. I must beg to take leave of you and return to the house. Both women turned back. Her ladyship was highly incensed. You have no regard, then, for the honour and credit of my nephew. Unfeeling, selfish girl. Do you not consider that a connection with you must disgrace him in the eyes of everybody? Lady Catherine, you have said quite enough. I shall not stand here and allow you to insult my family and me in the worst possible way. I have nothing further to say. You know my sentiments. You are then resolved to have him? I already have him. The only thing that remains to be done is the exchange of wedding vows, which, thanks to you, I plan to do much sooner rather than later. A special license shall suit us perfectly well. And this is your real opinion. This is your final resolve. Very well. I shall now know how to act. Do not imagine, Miss Bennet, that your ambition will ever be gratified. I came to try you. I hope to find you reasonable, but depend upon it, I will carry my point. Lady Catherine talked on in this manner till they were at the garden's iron gate, when, turning hastily round, she added, I take no leave of you, Miss Bennet. I send no compliments to your mother. You deserve no such attention. On the contrary, I am most seriously displeased. Soon enough, her ladyship disappeared from Elizabeth's sight. Good riddance! Knowing that her mother and sisters would be eager for a full account of the grand lady's visit, Elizabeth proceeded directly to the back of the house and made her way outside. She wanted nothing to do with anybody, not even Jane. She simply wanted to be alone. Such was the disturbance in her mind. With Lady Catherine's breach of etiquette, the ensuing conversation was bound to proceed without much order. Still, Elizabeth was caught off guard when she discovered that the subject of their conversation was not only to encourage her to break the engagement with Mr. Darcy, but to do so under the inducement of a large financial reward. A sort of shock had come over Elizabeth, cutting her like a knife. Is such acrimony and discord what awaits me as the wife of Mr. Darcy? Chapter 23. At New Heights. Elizabeth escaped to the pond, her treasured spot. She did not like to have anyone see her cry. This was meant to be a joyful time in her life, regardless of the speed with which it had come about. Finally, all her dreams of meeting her knight in shining armour were coming true. Still, she could not help but cry, tears of gladness mixed with tears of sadness, she supposed. Will everyone in Mr. Darcy's family be as officious and unpleasant as his aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh? Elizabeth had told the proud woman that she cared little for the opinions of those so wholly unconnected to her, but the day she and Mr. Darcy married would be the day when all his noble relations would be connected to her. And what of his cousin Miss Anne de Bourgh? Would she play the part of the jilted lover? Would that be enough to poison Elizabeth in the minds of the rest of his family? Finally, what of his sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy? Was she as close to Miss Bingley as the latter often boasted? Will Mr. Darcy's young sister hate me too? And what about this faraway place in Derbyshire? Pemberley. Mr. Darcy's home. By all accounts, most of them from Miss Bingley, Pemberley was the grandest place in all the county, if not magical, then certainly renowned. But still it was far, far away from the people she loved most in the world. How would she endure being separated from her family so soon? Amid her busy mind's conjecture of all that had led her to that moment, and the uncertainty of how her future life would be, what else was a young lady to do but cry? Elizabeth had her head buried in both hands when she heard a familiar voice asking, "Elizabeth, my love, what is the matter?" She immediately tried to wipe her tears away and, as best she could, put on a happy smile. Mr. Darcy sat down beside her and drew her into his arms, encouraging her to rest her head on his shoulder. Elizabeth loved doing that. "I am here," he whispered. She took a breath and let it out slowly. She quickly wiped away the few lingering tears that had escaped. She scooted closer. They were so close. Elizabeth could feel the heat from Mr. Darcy's body. She leaned into him, and he hugged her tightly, resting his chin on her head. She closed her eyes. "Is this because of my aunt? I just learned of her visit to Longbourn. I am so sorry you were subjected to her officiousness. Instead of dealing directly with me on the matter, my aunt chose to direct her venom toward you. I shall see that she never threatens you again. You are to be my wife." He kissed the top of her head. "How can I make amends?" She took another deep breath. "Sir, I hardly know where to begin. At times I feel as though I know nothing at all about you," Elizabeth said. She spoke nothing but the truth. So much of what she knew of Mr. Darcy's background she had learned from the Bingleys, Miss Caroline Bingley in particular. Elizabeth continued, "And yet we are to be married, and I shall soon leave the only home I have ever known, the only life I have ever known, and be thrust into yours. Pray, tell me everyone will not be some incarnation of your Aunt Lady Catherine." "I wish that I could, but alas, I cannot." "What? Are you saying such loathing and acrimony is what I have to look forward to? You know as well as I do that the world is filled with every kind of people. I shall do my best to protect you from the ills of society, although I suspect I know you well enough to know you can hold your own just fine. As for my relations, I promise you that Lady Catherine is truly the worst of them all. I wager you will come to love my relations as a whole. I know they will love you. What about your sister? Is she not an intimate friend of Miss Bingley's? No, not particularly. There is such a gap in our ages, what with Georgiana being more than 10 years my junior. There is no reason to suppose she is especially close to any of my acquaintances, despite what Miss Bingley may have told you. How old is your sister? Elizabeth asked. I can only suppose you have written to her and told her about me, about our hasty engagement. Yes, of course I have, he replied. Georgiana is 16, and she could not have received the news with too much surprise. I have often mentioned you in my letters since I have been here in Hertfordshire. I assure you, my love, you are no stranger to my sister, he said. He leaned and kissed Elizabeth again, this time on her chin. Well, I hope I do not disappoint her when we meet, for I can only imagine what you must have written, Elizabeth said, pulling back to look at him. You, no doubt, told her that you have met the most impertinent country lass on this side of England, that I toss convention to the wind and I am completely heedless where propriety is concerned. Perhaps words to that effect, said Mr. Darcy. He commenced a trail of sweet kisses along her neck. I could not very well tell her how I really felt toward you, that I rescued you, made love to you, and desired nothing else but you from that moment on. No, Elizabeth said breathlessly. Her lips met his. At length she said, that would never do. And, of course, there was no mention of your trying to pretend you did not know me for the longest time in the aftermath of your daring rescue, she teased. Did I do that? You know you did, Mr. Darcy. What was I thinking? By the way, when do you plan to return my sailboat to me? Your sailboat? It is my sailboat now. The one who finds it keeps it. Are you not aware of that fundamental truth? Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth whispered in his ear, you, sir, are incorrigible. Mr. Darcy meant to show his future bride just how incorrigible he could be. Soft moans blanketed the air, occasionally interrupted by tender words whispered between them. Of course, it had to be that way, and yet another reason to marry by special license. Mr. Darcy could not wait to make Elizabeth his wife, in the best possible way, the ultimate way. Chapter 24. Absolutely delighted. Happy was the day Mrs. Bennet got rid of her second eldest daughter. She always knew Elizabeth was clever, but could never have imagined her obstinate, headstrong daughter attracting the notice of a man like Mr. Darcy. Indeed, he was as good as a lord. The proud lady's happiness increased when 2 months later saw Jane married to Mr. Charles Bingley. 2 rich daughters with such upstanding husbands. Miss Bennet could finally go about her life in peace, secure in the knowledge that whatever happened to Mr. Bennet, she would not be tossed into the hedgerows. Mr. Bennet was as he ever was, perfectly content not to be bothered. With 2 daughters well settled, he had even less cause for concern regarding his family's future well-being. The recluse country gentleman was now free to enjoy all his cherished books at his leisure. When he grew tired of them, it was a comfort knowing the library at Netherfield and even the renowned one at Pemberley were at his complete disposal. Now that was what he called happiness. Elizabeth's friend Charlotte married Mr. William Collins. When thinking of her friend's marriage, despite its being a shock and degradation in her eyes, Elizabeth could attest that at least Charlotte was true to her word. She saw a chance to claim Mr. Collins as her own. She married him, and now she was the mistress of her own home in Kent and the future mistress of Longbourn to boot. Indeed, Charlotte knew exactly what she was about. Miss Bingley could never forgive Elizabeth for her betrayal, and she held on to her resentment, even though it meant giving up her right to visit Pemberley. Elizabeth could not say how she felt about that turn of events. No one liked to think of themselves as having an enemy. Although, when she thought about it, as the wife of Mr. Darcy and the mistress of Pemberley, she had no actual cause to repine, even if Miss Bingley's connection with Jane made it likely that Elizabeth and the embittered woman should unavoidably be crossing paths. The very nature of her relationship with Mr. Darcy and its means of coming about prevented Elizabeth from meeting any of his family before they announced their engagement. That was to say, anyone other than Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Nevertheless, it delighted Elizabeth to find that not all of his relations were like her ladyship. All the disappointed noblewoman's threats of censure and considerable disdain amounted to nothing. In time, Elizabeth knew she would love Mr. Darcy's family very much, just as her relations in town grew to love Mr. Darcy. There is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one an unfavourable idea of his heart, was Elizabeth's favourite aunt's commendation upon first meeting Mr. Darcy in Cheapside. Elizabeth could not have been more pleased upon hearing this. As for her new sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy, she grew to love Elizabeth so much that she now called Pemberley her home, and the relationship between the two sisters was everything Mr. Darcy hoped it would be. Indeed, Miss Darcy proved to be a moderating influence on Elizabeth's three younger sisters, who often visited her in town and in Derbyshire by their mother's design for them to land rich husbands of their own. In patterning their behaviour after Miss Darcy's, the younger girls were far less silly, and Mary's prowess on the pianoforte increased tenfold. One thing Elizabeth discovered about her husband that she had not fully appreciated before they were married was he did not like to be teased. He really did not. To her way of thinking, that was his misfortune, for she dearly loved to exercise such liberty with him. The subject of her confiscated sailboat was often fodder for her teasing, for it appeared he truly did not mean to return it to her. He had even gone so far as to claim he had left it at Netherfield upon his departure, much to Elizabeth's vexation. How could he do such a thing? On a particularly pleasant day in Derbyshire, Elizabeth walked blindfolded by her husband's side. If she were to guess where they were, she would probably suggest one of Pemberley's many lakes and streams, except they had taken a carriage. She was uncertain if they were still on the estate. "Pray, Mr. Darcy, why are you keeping me in suspense like this? You know what a curious creature I am. May I remove this cloth from my eyes at once?" He patted her hand. "Patience, my love." Soon enough he halted their steps, took his place behind his wife, kissed the nape of her neck and said, "Prepare yourself to be delighted." Then he lowered her eye covering. A large sailboat sat adrift on the water a short distance from where they stood. It was a full, life-sized replication of Elizabeth's toy sailboat, except it had her name on the side, in large, bold letters. L-I-Z-Z-Y. Now it was Elizabeth's turn to drag her husband by the hand, such was her excitement. "You did this for me? You shouldn't have," she cried. "Not that I am not absolutely delighted, but when did you have time to do all this?" "I always have time to attend to your pleasures, my love," Mr. Darcy said, pulling Elizabeth back into his arms. He brushed a kiss atop her forehead. "I take it you are pleased." "Indeed I am," she exclaimed with energy. "When shall the two of us set sail? I have always dreamed of sailing off to faraway places." "And I always intend to make all your dreams come true, although I am afraid this particular boat will not take us very far. We shall require a far grander vessel for what I have in mind for you. As long as it is the two of us, be it on the high seas or, dare I say, a quaint little pond, I shall have no cause to repine." "Then by all means, my love," Mr. Darcy said, taking Elizabeth by the hand and leading her onward. "Come, sail away with me." Thank you for listening to Somebody Else's Gentleman, written by P.O. Dixon, read by Lily. If you enjoyed the story, and I sincerely hope you did, please take a moment to like, share, and comment. If you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to do so now. It makes all the difference in encouraging me to share these stories here, on YouTube. And be sure to search for and listen to more of my stories like this one. Stories that will make you fall in love, time and time again. Your support helps this channel grow,